Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories to help you relax and fall asleep. And comment, where are you watching from and the time you are watching this video. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. The Crossbow Killer of Lake Attabat. The summer before heading off to college, my friend Camden and I were celebrating our last summer together. We'd grown up together as neighbors, but we were heading off to different colleges. Our plans were about as simple as they can get. There was a blank space in our calendars, a decent sum on our bank accounts, and a gassed-up car. That's it. That first week was insane. Camden had to balance constant calls from his mom with being an absolute beast. He'd be doing cranberry vodka shots 1 second and calmly describe his breakfast in perfect detail the next. We spent 2 days with his distant relatives in Rochester. He may or may not have made out with his own cousin during a particularly high-stakes truth or dare. I can neither confirm nor deny. A couple of days before heading home, we decided to have a final camping night. We split up for a day to see our families and get some supplies. Then we met up at Lake Attabat. Lake Attabat is a bit of a local secret. We got to know about it from Camden's cousins, who more or less dared us to go there. I mean, they expressly told us not to go there, but we took it as a challenge. It was supposed to be an old fishing lake surrounded by small cabins for rent, but the owners had neglected them for decades. All that was left were these crumbling log cabins and an absolutely stunning beach. I was looking forward to getting some alone time with Camden. We'd been so busy living the high life that we hadn't gotten any time to just chill, to talk about the future and make plans. Maybe we'd go fishing, but when I rolled up to Lake Attabat, Camden was already there, and he wasn't alone. He brought 4 friends to keep the party going. The only one I knew by name was Harris. He'd been an acquaintance, hanging at the edge of our social circle for a while. A weird guy who asked a lot of questions. But I also knew that the only reason Camden would invite him would be to get a shot at his older sister. We'd never been formally introduced, but her name was Tammy. She didn't look the part of your average law student. She looked much more at home in a mosh pit in a sweaty basement. Tammy had, in turn, brought 2 of her sorority friends. The 3 of them were in the process of claiming the least rotten cabin off the beach, as Camden and Harris collected firewood. Camden waved me over, calling out everyone to come meet me. My heart sank a little. It was going to be fun, but I would have liked to just spend some time with my friend too. This was quickly turning into something different. I was surrounded by smiles as I was introduced to Tammy, Pam, and Carrie. Harris gave me an uncertain wave from the sidelines. Camden wrapped an arm around my neck. "This is my brother right here," he called out. "I'm the pretty one, he's the good one." And just like that, the stage was set. We ended up making a fire by the beach, grilling a few hot dogs, and having a couple of beers. Harris wasn't feeling it and ended up spending most of his time fixing the old floating dock instead. I noticed Kari was giving me a little extra attention. She was a peculiar woman with a long face and almost cartoonishly large eyes, but her confidence and genuine personality was difficult not to like. I ended up talking to her for well over an hour. Harris came back with his hands on his hips, clearing his throat to get some attention. "I need something to tie the tanks with," he said. "The what?" Camden asked. "What are you talking about?" "The barrels. The things that makes the dock float," Harris sighed. "I need something to tie them on." "Just ditch it," Camden frowned. "Come on, sit down, have a snack." "Didn't we say we were going to fix this thing?" Harris snapped back. "Or was that just something you said to keep me busy?" It got awfully quiet. I looked around and pointed to one of the old cabins. "I think I saw a garden hose out back," I said. "You can use that, won't rot." Harris gave his sister and Camden a long look. He shook his head, thanking me under his breath. To Harris's credit, he managed to fix that floating dock. It was big enough for all 6 of us as long as we stood up. If someone was going to sunbathe on it, we might fit 3 if we crowded a bit. The thing was surprisingly solid. Harris definitely knew a couple of sailors' knots to keep the supports in place. Harris and his sister were polar opposites. While Harris kept to himself, Tammy was taking bikini selfies next to the no diving sign. Pam was off talking to her parents on her phone, while Kari and I was sitting beachside, dipping our feet in the warm water. The sun was setting in about an hour or so, covering the lake in a golden glow. It was going to be a great night, I could tell. We all went out on the floating dock, Tammy and Camden sitting side by side at the edge, kicking us out into the lake. We were cheering, teasing, laughing, all the things you're supposed to do when you're young and curious. We went out on the middle of the lake. Everyone but Harris dove in headfirst, ignoring the abandoned no diving sign. The lake was colder than expected, and I wasn't the only one to shiver a little. That didn't stop us, though. Within seconds, I saw a bikini top being tossed around like a ball, and there were smiles every which way I turned. Well, except for Harris. He turned to us, saying something. I'm not sure what. He was pointing, trying to get our attention, but that wasn't happening anytime soon. I had Kari right next to my ear, asking me to keep her warm. Camden and Tammy were just full-on making out against the floating dock. I casually looked the way Harris pointed. I could see something in the distance. There was someone on the beach. I didn't know what to make of it. Even at a distance, I could tell they were tall, somewhere around 6'8", possibly a man. He was wearing some kind of World War II-era rubber gas mask, but without a filter. He had this massive gray trench coat that looked too big even on him. It left a long trail in the sand. There were countless pockets sewn on the outside. He had a crossbow. Not one of those black, sleek modern ones, but something he'd put together in a garage somewhere. The thing was massive, probably made from the leaf spring of an old car. It was solid metal. The second we looked his way, he hooked the crossbow to something on his belt and stepped it into the sand. Despite such a massive frame, I could tell he was struggling. There was a loud click. He pulled something out of his coat, an arm's length of sharpened rebar. It just took a couple of seconds, all in all, and the sight was too strange to react to appropriately. Harris looked back at the rest of us as the conversation died down. We were still smiling, but it wasn't a conscious reaction. It felt like rabbits freezing at the sight of a predator, hoping it wouldn't see us. But of course it did. We were completely exposed on the open water. Harris turned to his sister, casually pointing towards the beach. You know that guy? Tammy clung to Camden's shoulder, looking towards the beach. I saw her eyes go wide as the man on the beach raised the crossbow. He didn't need time to aim. We were sitting ducks. There was a click, a thunk, and a whip-like snap. It was less than a second. A bolt of sharpened rebar as long as my arm burrowed deep into Harris's chest. There was no scream or cry, just a puff of air as his lungs emptied. I still hear that sound sometimes. A single forceful cough, like he swallowed something the wrong way. The force was so intense that it looked like turning off a switch. Harris smacked down into the floating dock with complete abandon, splaying his arms out like a crucifixion. Immediate panic erupted. Camden held Tammy back from climbing up on the floating dock. Carrie and Pam hid under it. I didn't understand what was happening and lingered a little too long, watching our attacker hook the crossbow on his belt and step down, preparing for a second shot. Hadn't it been for Camden calling my name, I wouldn't have snapped out of it. I dove, swam over to the others, and hid under the floating dock. There was already blood dripping between the planks. Tammy couldn't stop screaming, her eyes so wide they looked black. The shouting was so loud and constant that it just blended into a mix, making it sound like nothing at all. This was just what the world was like now. Panicked, open mouths screaming at everyone for answers. There was an awful crackling sound as 4 planks were torn apart by a second shot. The force rippled through the air, and I could feel it even at a distance. We all hid under the dock, keeping our heads down and trying to show as little of ourselves as possible. But seconds later, I heard him firing again. Another couple planks exploded into tattered fibers, the whole funneling Harris's blood right down on us, mixing the smell of wet wood with sickening volumes of blood. Everyone was talking and screaming over one another. Carrie was screaming at us to dive, while Pam was telling us to split up. We didn't do either. Instead, I watched through the gaps in the dock how the man reloaded again and got down on his knees. He was planning something. He was shooting at an angle, trying to get the bolt to skip across the surface. It worked. There was this approaching thoo-thoo-thoo noise heading straight for us. I could see the ripples on the lake where the bolt had touched down. It was dark under the dock, but I could hear the shot slamming into the back of Pam's cranium. The water got warm as life left her. Tammy tried to get away, but Camden was holding her back. If she swam out from under the dock, she'd be an easy target. Instead, we hid behind the supports. These large white air tanks made of hardened plastic with little blue sunflower logos on the side. Another shot rippled across the water. Thoo, 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 thoo. It smashed through the dock, effectively ripping it in half as the last planks shattered. Some of the supports came loose, but me and Kari clung to them like life vests. "They're not hard enough," Camden screamed, holding Tammy close. "We gotta do something." "What?" Kari screamed back. "What the fuck are we supposed to do?" Thoo, 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 thoo. Another shot. This one crashed into the side of the support I was holding onto, ripping it out of my arms. It snapped my shoulder so bad that I got a bruise. It was such massive force, like a battering ram. I was fine, but left exposed. I got a clear view of him hooking the crossbow to his belt again and stepping down on the crossbow, already preparing another bolt from his jacket. I waved at Camden, showing I was okay, then I dove. The support I'd been hiding behind was intact, but had drifted off about 10 feet. I could make it. Diving down, the water was surprisingly clear. I could almost see all the way to the bottom. There was more debris than I anticipated. Things blown out from the beach and claimed by the lake. A ruined rowboat, an old tarp, the remains of a parasol. The screaming was just a faint murmur. I saw their feet kicking wildly. Looking over at Kari, her feet had stopped kicking and the water was turning red. The screams got louder, but not from her. I came up behind the white air tank I'd been clinging to. Tammy wasn't even making sense at this point. It was just an animalistic screeching. Camden looked like a fish out of water, his mouth wide open. The floating dock was broken in two, but the pieces were still held up by the remaining supports. It was a little easier to hide behind, but it was just a matter of time before this whole thing would sink. I dove down again. At first, it was to get away from a potential shot, but I had an idea. I swam down and grabbed the tarp and the old parasol. It was just a couple of aluminum poles at this point. Coming back up, I held the tarp over myself like a makeshift tent, using one of the poles at an angle. I figured it might obscure me just enough for him to miss a shot or two. It smelled like old dirt and algae, but I was too panicked to care. "He's gonna run out of bolts," Camden yelled. "We gotta bait them out." There was something to it. The bolts were large, and even with a large jacket, there couldn't be that many left. Tammy watched him closely, and as soon as he finished reloading, she called out, "Now." Then we all dove, trying to move around. I ducked my head under the surface as I heard that approaching thoo-thoo-thoo-thoo. Another bolt gone, disappeared into the lake. I came back up, hiding under that tarp. I tried to take long breaths, but it was difficult. Not knowing when the next bolt would fire meant it could come just as I exhaled. As Tammy called out another "now," I dove down like a bullet. I looked back at the others. No more blood in the water. All feet were still kicking. We managed to bait another couple bolts. Then it was a long pause. No one was calling out anything. I looked out from under the tarp. Camden and Tammy were looking out from the side of the wrecked dock. The man in the gas mask was just standing there at the shore, looking at us. He seemed to have one more bolt at the ready, but was reluctant to fire. Maybe he wanted to align that perfect shot. "He's waiting for us to get out," Camden said. "He can't keep guessing. He needs a clear shot." Tammy just stared at him. She couldn't look away. Camden was talking to her, but his words just passed right through. "He can't stay here forever," Camden continued. "We wait, and then we split up." Tammy nodded, keeping her eyes on him still. We must have stayed in the water for well over an hour, clinging to the remains of the dock. The sun was setting, quickly making the water inhospitable. We were shivering and our lips turned blue. There was a very real chance we'd get hypothermia. My hands were cramped into claws from holding on to the air tank too hard. I could barely feel my feet. He wasn't leaving. He was standing in that exact same spot, waiting to load his crossbow. The bolt dangled from his hand. Camden's jaw was chattering. He was worse off than me and Tammy. I was getting worried he might lose consciousness if we didn't act soon. It was getting darker, so it would be harder to hit us. It was now or never. We had to try. We decided to go on the count of 3. Tammy counted us down. 3, 2, 1. We all got out of cover. Tammy called out, "Now," and I dove. The final bolt sailed right past us. Thoo. We were in the clear. I popped my head up to see the others heading straight for the shore. The man was just standing there, trying to figure out his next move. We were halfway to the shore when I saw him put his hand down his other jacket pocket. He pulled out another bolt. It was a trick. He'd faked running out. Camden called on us to scatter. Tammy told us to keep going for the shore. I begged them to get to cover. Our voices intermingled into a yelling mess as I saw him step down on the crossbow and load another bolt. He took aim at us. "Now!" Tammy called out. "Fucking now!" We all dove, but we were out of breath. A couple of seconds passed, and as I broke through the surface, I heard that familiar thumping. Thoo. Except now, it connected to something with a sickening crunch. I hid behind one of the air tanks, and I could see someone else do the same in the distance. I couldn't see who it was. The lake got eerily quiet, leaving only the echo of birdsong. I was colder than I thought. I hadn't noticed my teeth chattering. I clung to the side of that air tank, letting my legs rest. I had to break the silence. "Camden?" I called out. "Yeah," he responded. His voice was weak, his throat raw. It barely sounded like him anymore. I could almost hear his breathing, even from a distance. "Tammy?" he called out. "Tammy, are you?" There was no response, only bird song. Another click as a bolt was loaded. I could barely see the man on the shore, but the silhouette was clear. The crossbow was raised and ready. He was listening, aiming. He might have had more bolts than we'd anticipated, but he was making them count. I slowly paddled back towards the tarp I dragged up, wrapping it over the air tank. In the dark and from a distance, it sort of looked like a person. "I'm heading to shore," Camden called out. "See you there." "Hold on," I called back. "Wait a minute." "I can't, man," he sighed. "I can't. I gotta." "Hold on," I repeated. "Don't fuck this up." There was no response. I just heard the pitter-patter of someone paddling back to shore. I got out of cover, beelining towards Camden. Another thunk as a bolt released. Thoo. It smacked into the air tank I'd covered with the tarp, punching a hole straight through. Camden called out my name, but I didn't respond. I figured if the attacker thought he'd gotten me, maybe he would stop firing. Then again, maybe he'd go for Camden instead. I had to keep a low profile. Something brushed against my leg. I was in the middle of the debris from the floating dock. There was a piece of garden hose that Harris had used for repairs. I carefully brought it up, blowing out the water inside. I could use it as a makeshift snorkel. I swam towards the shore at an angle, as slowly as I could. As I got closer, I dove down. Fumbling with my stiff hands, I found a large rock. I held it close as an anchor to weigh me down. I held the hose up over the surface. I could breathe through it, but it was bitter taste, leaving a layer of bacteria on my tongue. The waves would sometimes go a little higher than anticipated, forcing a gulp of water going down my gullet. It was probably the longest couple of minutes of my life. I was shivering with every step, clinging to a slippery stone at the bottom of the lake. Shallow breaths interrupted by little drops tickling my throat. But I had to keep going. The water was getting too cold. Soon enough, my head was just below the surface. I had to be really close to the shore. I got down on my knees, crawling the last few feet. As my head breached the surface, I saw that I was off to the side, away from the beach. There were rocks covering the ground, cutting the soles of my feet as I struggled to stay quiet. The evening air was chilling. I made my way through the underbrush, stepping on roots and fallen branches along the way. I couldn't feel my fingers, and my teeth wouldn't stop chattering. I stepped over a fallen chain-linked fence, noticing a half-rusted old metal sign. A few letters had faded, but the message was clear. Private property. Violators will be shot. There was even a little smiley in the corner. I saw the beach from the tree line. Camden had made it ashore, but he was barely holding on. He was laying in the sand, doing his best just to breathe. The man with the gas mask was approaching him with a loaded crossbow. But he wasn't shooting. Not yet. If he wanted Camden dead, he'd be dead already. Instead, he just approached. He poked at Camden with the tip of his boot, but nothing happened. No reaction. I think Camden had lost consciousness by then. Maybe losing everyone was too much for him to bear. No matter the cause, Camden had completely given up. The crossbow man seemingly decided against wasting a bolt on him. Instead, he calmly raised the no diving sign that Tommy had posed with earlier, unloaded his crossbow, and wandered off like nothing had happened. As soon as the coast was clear, I ran like a man possessed. By the time I made it to Camden, he was barely breathing. I looked around the beach, couldn't see my things in the dark. I tapped Camden on the cheek, trying to get him to focus, but his eyes were rolled back. There was a noise. It came from Camden's clothes, just a little further down by the water. His phone. It was his worried parents, calling for the third time today. It was easy to forget how often Camden talked to them. I must have sounded absolutely unhinged when I answered, begging them to call for help. Not long after that, I had the emergency services on the line. I had to perform CPR to keep Camden breathing. By the time the EMTs got there, he'd lost a lot of color. We were both severely hypothermic. Those few final minutes at Lake Attabat was nothing short of psychedelic. Colored lights from 4 different vehicles mixing in the dark, highlighting angry and stressed faces. The occasional flash of a camera photographing a body washed up on the beach. A paramedic trying to get me to focus on a little light that he held in front of my eyes. I heard him talk, but it was too distant, like he wasn't really there. For a moment, I thought I might have hallucinated this whole thing. Maybe I was still out on the lake. Maybe this was me watching my life pass before my eyes. I could hear that thumping noise as the metal bolt skipped across the surface in my mind. I could hear it so loudly and clearly that it might as well have been real, a problem that persists to this day. And as we left Lake Attabat, I could imagine the glare of 2 slides of glass from a gas mask in the distance. Watching. Waiting. The police came to talk to me at the hospital. They were asking about us trespassing. And what happened? They didn't seem to believe me when I told them about the crossbow man. Autopsies revealed that Pam, Carrie, Harris, and Tammy all had alcohol in their bodies, which was enough to blame it all on some kind of accident. The police had a smashed floating dock, plenty of alcohol, and 4 dead bodies. They connected their own lines, puncture wounds, and witness statements, be damned. There were no charges, no investigation, no outcry. Harris and Tommy's parents lost 2 children that day. Camden and I have since tried talking to them, but there has just been no reasoning with them. I don't blame them. They're completely broken. Camden and I have been back there a couple of times putting up signs of our own, warning passers-by of a murderer. I was back there last year, and someone had taken the sign down. The no diving sign was as visible as ever, though. That last summer at Lake Attabat was the worst thing I've ever experienced. Just seeing a body of water can make my teeth chatter nowadays. It's like my blood remembers before my mind does. I'm thankful that I can still talk to Camden about it. I think he's taken it worse than me. He's much quieter nowadays, and he rarely goes outside. We're the only ones who really know, and the only ones who truly believe. We're tried to tell others, but they think we're making this up. It sounds much better to have a crossbow-wielding lunatic than people drowning from alcohol poisoning in a failing floating dock, and people believe what they want. There are accidents all the time, people go missing all the time, but sometimes the answer is right there, and no one is asking the questions. But that was only the beginning. Another nightmare was about to unfold. Sleep Part 1. You know how we say that we don't really know why humans need to sleep? I mean, we do to an extent, but it's still a massive scientific work in progress. The body uses time sleeping to do a ton of wild stuff, from healing the body to compartmentalizing memories. The only thing is, that's all we've found so far. Of course, the best way to study what something does is by studying what happens in the absence of it. The longest on record is 18 days, and by that time, the cognitive function of most people isn't too great. Granted, this was all done without using any kind of performance enhancers, so to speak. I got the job offer weeks ago, a sleep deprivation study sponsored by the US government. Ethical? Absolutely not. But they gave me a proposition I couldn't refuse, to use the old cliché. You see, I'm genetically predisposed to a prion disease called fatal familial insomnia. Right now I haven't shown any signs of it, and on average it doesn't start to onset until around 50, so I have a few good years left before things go to hell for me. So while I can, I've dedicated myself to research into finding a cure for prion diseases, in some desperate hope that I can fix my own genetic fuck-up. No luck so far, but they recruited me with the promise of access to CRISPR technology to further work on genetic modifications, and I wasn't passing that up. Even if I can't do it for myself in time, if it can save people down the line from the hell I saw my mother go through. The hell that awaited me whenever the fucking prion decided it was my time. So, the basic thesis of the experiment was that we have 5 subjects, all people that were made to disappear by good old Uncle Sam. We weren't given any previous information or even names, just these 5 people, literally assigned numbers as their names, so we couldn't figure out who they were. These people would be studied as they were deprived of sleep, using any methods possible to make sure they stayed conscious. These methods would range from drugs, rewards, torture, or anything that would prevent sleep. Again, it wasn't ethical, but I'm doing this to hopefully save some innocent people down the line. Myself, 2 other researchers, 1 guard to each of the subjects were given a modestly sized lab environment to work with, and amenities for non-subjects were pretty nice. We had beds, a full kitchen complete with a cook who came in for lunch, dinner, and entertainment for those of us not currently working. Good thing, because this place was our home for the foreseeable future, until this experiment was over. The subjects had things a lot less comfortable than we did. They were kept in a common room, with individual rooms that split off from it, consisting of bathrooms/showers and various entertainment options. I know, giving people so awful they were erased by the government doesn't seem like a great thing, but we want to keep their minds stimulated to keep them awake. There would be meals brought in at regular intervals, all with the sufficient nutrition needed to thrive. Every single room was monitored by no less than 3 cameras, even the bathrooms, so we could constantly keep watch on every subject. In addition, there was a viewing room in front of the main common area, one-way glass, allowing us to directly observe. From here on, everything is presented from my daily research notes for a full picture of how things develop. This is the personal record of Dr. Michael A. Ripley, kept for my own future research and records. Day 1. Everything is going smoothly so far. I met my fellow researchers, Philip and Taryn, early on, and we determined how we would split work and observation. 8-hour shifts each. Taryn would take the midnight to 8 a.m., I would take over until 4 p.m., then Philip would finish out the night before Taryn came back to cover for him. It was easy enough, and we would have at least 2 guards keeping watch with us at all times in case a situation arose. Taryn's shift came and went without incident. The subjects were gathered around one of the tables, folding chairs set up for seats. That was the most comfort they had, though. There were no beds, only a hard metal cot on the walls with no padding or pillow. I'm assuming that's about what they were accustomed to, though, because nobody is really complaining about it. Subject 1 is a male in his mid-20s, dark hair, scrawny, pale as hell, looked like a school shooter stereotype. 2 is an older man, early 50s, balding and covered in some questionable tattoos. We weren't given any info on what he did, but you don't get that many swastikas permanently inked on by making good life decisions. 3 is in his 40s. He had a kind face, wry smile that looked like he would crack a dad joke at any time. Honestly, a pretty jovial guy. Probably the only one who I have no idea how he could have ended up here. 4 looked like Jeffrey Dahmer reborn in the digital age. I assume he's in for similar acts as Dahmer too. Hearing him talk over the monitor gave me the creeps, just monotone and uncaring. There was nothing behind his eyes. 5 looked like the American Psycho type. Wealthy, no human empathy or consideration for life, and that Tom Cruise look where every little move was rehearsed to best manipulate anyone he interacted with. I swear I saw him staring into the cameras a few times, right at me, and he would just smile. None of them knew what the experiment was. As of now, the sleep deprivation methods weren't in play, being so early. It wouldn't be until near the middle of my shift that things needed a little push. 2 was yawning and said he was going to his bunk for a nap. So, I hit the dial in his room to make sure that didn't happen. There was no control for the lighting on their end, so I dialed up the intensity of the fluorescence. Then, I activated a small speaker hidden behind his bed, playing a frequency that would disrupt any attempt at sleep for a while. The others stayed in the commons area, bullshitting about why they were here. Nothing of note happened otherwise. They're getting irritable. To be expected, considering that they're now hitting over 24 hours without sleep. So far, the light and sound methods of deprivation have worked fine, with nobody wise to what's happening yet. I do believe the irritability will lead to tensions by tomorrow. 4 is beginning to exhibit paranoia, frequently looking around, speaking to himself under his breath, and generally acting on edge. More than once I've seen him staring directly into the camera, though I'm not sure if he realized it was there. Creeped me out, nonetheless. Around noon on my shift, 1 began to speak to 3. I've transcribed their conversation below. 1, do you see them? Sorry? Who? I can see all of us in here, but nothing else. The kids. Excuse me? They told me what you did. I don't know what you're talking about. 1. Sure you do. How many were there? 3, please leave me alone. Why should I leave you alone? At this point, I called in one of the guards, Murray, just in case something started to go down in there. 3, despite his kinder, laid-back attitude, was definitely starting to get on edge. 1 did leave him alone, though, walking over to his own room and sitting on the metal cot, staring at the wall for the next 2 hours with this smile on his face like he was totally zoned out. I'm still not sure what any of them did, so I don't know if 1 was actually onto something or not. 3 was certainly shaken by it, though, sitting alone and not saying anything for the rest of the day. Eventually, he went to his room, laying on the cot while tossing and turning. From the notes Philip left, he's been complaining of the others being too loud, saying they're shouting when everyone is talking in whispers at best. Likely an early sign of prolonged sleep deprivation. 2 and 4 have been oddly friendly, though I'm not entirely sure why. I've heard them briefly talk about their jobs in their early life. 2 was some sort of construction contractor, while 4 specialized in industrial chemicals. Of course, that's before or during whatever got them in here. I'll keep an eye on how their relationship develops. I expect many of them to break down after a certain point. Day 3. Today was relatively calm, with barely anything of note happening. The subjects have begun to isolate after over 48 hours without sleep, each staying to their own room or corner of the main area. I have noticed 4 increasingly talking to himself, more hurried and louder than previously. Most of it was nonsense, sounding like the paranoid ramblings of some budget Alex Jones. Subject 5 is the one that's been most interesting to watch. He's going along with this just fine, not even a sign of irritability or paranoia. All he's done is sit in his own corner, just watching the others. Occasionally, he would give a smirk, but for the most part, he just remained quiet there. Day 4. They've begun to realize what's happening. 3 approached 5, asking him when the last time he slept was. Upon realizing it was before they were sent in here, they started to ask the others. 1 said he was awake for 72 hours prior to arriving, suffering from insomnia as is, so I guess we had a little head start there. Everyone else agreed they were going on day 4, though, referencing the clock and calendar on the wall to be sure. 2 began to get irritable, screaming to be let out and told what was going on. 3 tried to calm him, telling him it was likely we were being monitored. 4 started to search the entire place for cameras, though he didn't succeed. 1 was in his room, already deep in the throes of paranoia and whispering that they were coming for him. From what I can gather, he's seeing hallucinations. At one point, he was pointing at the door, screaming at something on the other side, telling it that it wasn't welcome in his room. It sounded like he was rebuking a vampire, telling it that it didn't have permission. At some point, 2 started screaming at him to shut up, the screams only getting louder as the rebuke from 1 turned into pleas with whatever was there to leave him alone. His cries were haunting, legitimately terrified of whatever the sleep deprivation was making him see. During all this, 5 remained in his corner, watching silently. He had by far done the least in his whole time here, but he had been awake the entire time. For my best guess, he was dissociating into a possible type of meditation, perhaps relieving some of his sleep deficiency. Day 5. Our methods to date for sleep deprivation are starting to become null. 2 has nodded off, while 4 was going into a state of microsleeps to compensate. We upped it to the next phase, introducing amphetamines through their meals. There was a very noticeable burst in alertness from everyone, though some started to display signs of what's commonly called cabin fever. 4 began to scratch at his skin, determined that something was trying to get out of his body. Guards were on standby to assess. Before long, he had gouged long lines in his arms, blood beginning to ooze from the wounds. Murray was sent in as medical, another guard named Greg accompanying to ensure the other subjects complied. Why are you injuring yourself? Because I need to let it out. Let what out? My soul. Your soul. Why do you need to let your soul out? Because it's been trapped. It wants out before it's stuck inside forever. All right, buddy, let's get you wrapped up to stop the bleeding. Mind telling me why the hell we're in here? I haven't slept since stepping through that door. You don't deserve an answer. Tell me what's going on. He became violent here, smashing a hand into the concrete wall. Draws gun. Calm the fuck down, man. No, you don't tell me what to do. I God-given rights to my life. You don't have rights anymore. After he left the room, Murray gave me the rundown of the current mood in there. The smell is terrible, according to him, and up close everyone looks ragged. Apparently the look in 4's eyes was that of a dead man, and Murray was former Special Forces, so I'll take his word on that. Philip told me that 4 was still trying to claw at his skin during the night, and the guards eventually had to go in and forcibly restrain him to keep him from doing any lasting damage. Since then, he's just begged for someone to kill him so his soul can leave. I don't know what he means by that, but the feeling of dread it's sunk into my gut is something that scares me. There's a foreboding here that I really don't like. Day 6, hiking, to put it lightly. Subject. 1 at this point has been awake the longest of them all, at least 9 days, give or take some hours. His onset of symptoms has been somewhat of a litmus test for the others, getting an idea of what could change. I fear, though, that we're only just getting into the worst of the symptoms. We got around 2 in the afternoon today when 1 went into his room, sitting on the metal cot. Everyone else was isolating, with 2 walking around and screaming every so often in anger. 3 was in his room, rocking back and forth under the bed, while apologizing under his breath. 4 was near catatonic in his room, staring at the wall. Meanwhile, 5 was just going about business. He was the only one to keep up some semblance of hygiene at this point, as the others hadn't showered since arriving. Pretty sure I saw some of them not even cleaning up after using the toilet, so I can't imagine the smell in the room. From what Murray told me yesterday, it made him want to gag. I was recording amphetamine dosages, making sure we weren't going to overdose anyone when I heard my name. At first I assumed it was Murray, checking in to see if I wanted anything from the kitchen. When I looked around and didn't find him, though, my name was spoken again, this time from over the sound feed. 1 was staring at the camera, addressing me directly as he gazed right into me through the monitor. 1. Why are you doing this, Michael? I didn't respond. I couldn't. There's no way he could know who I am. No way that he could know my name. They didn't even know we were here in the first place. As far as they knew, this was just a guard surveillance room behind the one-way glass. This won't help you. You can't be cured. At this point, I'm in the midst of an anxiety attack, full-blown panic, and pressing the little call button I had for the guards. Murray came shuffling in, asking if he had to go back into the shit pit again, as he called it now. He saw me in the midst of a meltdown, 1 still speaking to me directly. 1. You'll die screaming. You're lucky, though. At that point, Murray took me out of the room, shouting for Philip to come in and take over for a time. He sat me down in the small medical bay we had, stocked with typical EMS supplies, and gave me an anti-anxiety drug to try and get me to relax. Philip took over for the remainder of my shift and into his, so I could go on to bed and try to clear my mind. They believed me that he was talking, but were trying to give me rational reasons for what he was saying. He had been talking to himself, so maybe his name was Michael as well? Maybe it was just a hallucination of someone he knew previously? I was willing to accept any kind of rationalization at this point, but the dread was still sunk deep into my chest, telling me that wasn't the case. I'm going to lay down now, but wanted to type out these notes while they were fresh in my mind. The medicine is making me feel drowsy. Next part. The American sleep experiment is showing much different results than the Russian one. Series previous log day 7. I slept fitfully last night. This morning, though, I found out that Philip had a similar experience as I did. One was speaking to him in the same way, under his breath and laughing. Though he wouldn't tell me what he was saying, he was shaken to the core because one called him by name too. We decided to sit in with Taryn during her shift this morning, just in case anything happened. It didn't take too long. One was still sitting in his bunk, muttering under his breath, when he mentioned Taryn by name this time. 1. Do you miss it, Taryn? Taryn didn't know how to reply, obviously. She wasn't quite sure what was happening since she hadn't had the experience Philip and I had. Do you miss the way he touched you? She grew pale, running from the room and barely making it into the hallway before throwing up whatever breakfast she had. He does. He misses it. He was laughing now, chuckling under his breath. He's right here, if you'd like to say hello. Daddy misses you, Taryn. Jesus fucking Christ, was all Philip could manage to get out. I ran out after Taryn, trying to console her from the massive anxiety attack she was now having. The poor girl was crouched in a corner of the hallway, hands over her head like she was in a tornado drill, hyperventilating hard. Please make him stop, she sobbed, begging anyone that would listen. One of the other subjects started shouting at one as he laughed louder, pressing on their already frayed nerves. Philip shouted for me to come back as 2 walked into one's room, ready to fight. I called Murray over, getting him on standby in case things got bad. 2, would you shut the fuck up? He grabbed one, bashing his head into the wall like he was throwing a bloody alarm clock to shut it up. One didn't stop laughing, despite another hit right into the wall. Murray ran in, trying to keep one from being killed as 2 grabbed him again, going for another hit. One didn't stop laughing, now looking at 2. They found me. They'll find you soon too. You're out of your cell. The fuck are you even talking about, you little shit? How many girls were there? What? I can't count them all. The room is getting crowded. Smashes one's head into the wall again. Shut up! Shut up! Around this time, Murray ran in, another guard on duty following him to help restrain the big man. One was still laughing, now counting out loud. Honestly, if it wasn't for the caved-in part of his head, it would be hilarious. He was letting out a laugh between every number, like the damned Count on Sesame Street. Murray grabbed 2, pulling him back and throwing him into his own room before shutting the door, pulling out keys to lock it so he would have solitary time to chill out. For the first time, we had to pull a patient out, bringing one into the small medical bay to assess his injuries. By every part of science that I know of, he shouldn't have been alive, much less conscious right then. There he was, though, sitting on the medical table and laughing, muttering under his breath about all the lovely people coming out to make sure he was okay. I got chills then, because he started saying names as he looked around the room. Our exams were showing that he was in perfect cognitive shape still, other than the lack of sleep. Hell, it looks like he was starting to come back around into a more clarified state. What better time to get some direct answers, right? 1, what are you seeing right now? The other kids. Classmates, friends, bullies. What kids? The kids I buried. My blood ran cold, wondering if he could be delusional by this point. He was ahead of the others when it came to time awake, so his symptoms were definitely going to be more advanced than the others. Oh, hi, Coach. Mitchell? Suddenly, as I was examining his pupils to see if they were still reacting to light, he began to seize on the table. Before I knew what was happening, a mass of blood and organs erupted from his stomach, seemingly being grabbed and torn from the outside. Jesus, what in the hell? Mike, did you do that? I was backed away from the table now, blood spattered across my face and clothes. On the table, one was laughing harder now, looking around his surroundings wildly. Ah, that feels so much better. I rushed forward, desperately trying to fit his organs back into his abdomen and keep him alive. He looked more peaceful now, in some kind of relief from before. Despite the blood gushing from his insides, he wasn't showing any signs of trauma or stress in his psychological response. His body, at this point, should have been shutting down from shock, but he was almost refreshed, like he had just woken from a satisfying nap. One, can you still hear me? Oh yes, I can hear you. Sorry about that earlier. What exactly happened, One? They want to keep me here. They're still mad. I told you, the people I buried, the people I loved. I didn't want anyone else to get them, and now they don't want anyone else to get me. Get you? What do you mean? The jailer. I don't really know what he's talking about. After that, he just laid on the table while I did what I could to stitch him up. Whatever happened, it looked like he had been pulled every which way from the inside until his guts finally burst through his skin. Some organs were shredded, with his spleen in at least 3 different pieces that weren't going to do anything for him anymore. Despite all, he just stayed there, catatonic but smiling like he was finally comfortable. I stitched and bandaged his stomach, finally getting some of the bleeding under control. I wasn't sure what to do with the shredded organs I found, just removing them so they didn't go necrotic inside. The next thing he did is something that I, before now, would have thought was something from a horror movie. One got up, walking right to the door, with only a little bit of a limp in his gait. His skull half caved in, blood already oozing through the bandage. He walked from the medical bay, going to the door back into the subject room. As he passed by Taryn in the hallway, he briefly looked her way. One, I'm sorry about earlier. He was a very angry man, very intimidating. I see how it happens so much. What is wrong with you? How the hell did you know that? He was whispering in my ear. He looks back down the hallway to Murray and I. Can someone let me back in? I'd like to apologize to the bad man. What else was I supposed to do? We let him in and he went straight to Two's door, looking through the glass at the angry man, now banging on the thick glass of his door to try and get at the scrawny boy. He stopped in shock when he got a good look at him, noticing the massive amount of blood and caved-in head. One, I feel bad for you. I don't feel bad for many people, but you're about to have a bad time. Two, who the fuck are you? What do you know about me? One, everything. They told me all of it. They said they'll see you soon, though, so I don't need to do anything. 3, 4, and 5 were backed against the farthest wall they could be as One spoke. I think this was the first time I saw 5 break the cool exterior, genuine fear in his face as he looked at the mangled One. The worst, though, was 3, who was now pale and looked like he had seen a ghost. One turned to the rest of them, now that his apology was over. His flattened skull was unnerving, even watching over a security monitor as the other 3 subjects looked on in horror. One went into his room, smiling as he sat back down on his cot, going into a near catatonic state. Taryn was able to compose herself enough to tell us about why she had that reaction. I won't go too into her personal trauma, but to put it short, she was molested by her father as a child. At some point in her teens, she fought back, pushing him hard enough that he fell in their bathroom, cracking his head on the toilet and dying. She was in tears as she told us this, saying she had never told anyone but the cops and her therapist about this, and there shouldn't be any way that One would know. We compared notes, finding out that each of us had something he shouldn't know about. My disease, Taryn's trauma, and Philip, who confessed he'd killed 2 people in a drunk driving accident, one that his father managed to get him out of, thanks to some money and a prosecutor friend. Philip took over the rest of Taryn's watch while I tried to rest in preparation for mine. It was useless, though, as all I could see every time I closed my eyes was White. One being ripped to shreds from the inside out, smiling the whole time. He was thankful for what had happened, like they were protecting him some great evil that we didn't know of. I needed to figure out who this jailer he spoke of is. It's all my mind could think about as I tossed in bed for hours, expecting Philip to call me in at any moment about some new insanity. He didn't, much to my surprise, and I dragged myself in to prepare for my watch, getting up to speed from him as I poured a cup of coffee in the kitchen. For the most part, things were slow compared to the usual. I don't know if the chaos of the day already was a sign of peace for the rest, but I would take it at this point. I observed everyone closely. One was in a near catatonic state, awake but completely checked out. I don't know if it was because of his wounds or just the deprivation, but he was staring off into nothing, stupid smile on his face like he was daydreaming. 5 looked legitimately shaken now, peering around periodically in nervous glances. 2 was still locked in his room, while 3 was sitting in a corner, facing in and muttering to himself. 4, meanwhile, had taken to chewing on his fingernails, obsessively gnawing down like a dog going at a bone. Before long, he began to draw blood, chomping at fingertips and skin now. Murray went in, restraining his hands behind him to keep him from chewing on them while he wrapped them up. By the end, they were basically in full casts, keeping him from doing any real damage. Most of the remainder of my watch was uneventful, all things considered. 2 was surprisingly chill by the time I finished out, and Philip came back. But 1 was beginning to crack again. Murray and I decided it was best to isolate 1 for the time being, letting 2 out of his confinement. Philip took over so I could rest again before I took Taryn's shift. Day 8. Compared to the eventfulness of the previous few days, today was boring almost. I should be grateful for the quiet and calm, with the patients only showing spurts of delirium at this point between catatonic periods. I've theorized they're falling into microsleep periodically at this point in an automated survival measure. Microsleep will sustain their brain function while also keeping them conscious, allowing brief respites to the deprivation and the time to compartmentalize new mental information. It's no substitute for deep REM sleep, of course. 1 was still alive, though how, we have no fucking clue. He was still bleeding pretty steadily, with no signs of stopping, as there was a puddle of blood on his cot now. He didn't seem to mind, though, as he was starting to laugh again, falling back into delirium quickly as he went. I didn't sleep well again last night, the feelings of terror and images of one's insides haunting me again. His caved-in head is starting to show signs of possible swelling in the brain, beginning to bulge back out. If it's affecting him, though, he's not letting it known beyond the same deprivation symptoms. It kept me up all night, though, theorizing on what this jailer could be. From what I can tell, it's a hallucination of sleep itself, because 1 keeps talking about how he's been gone too long and it's going to notice. He says the other kids tell him about what the jailer will do, and it's, well, disturbing to say the least. I had Murray escort me to speak to 1 again, trying to get some answers as he was muttering under his breath again. Subject 1, who is the jailer you keep talking about? He keeps us here. Every time you go to sleep, he makes sure you don't stay here. Where is here? Awake. So this jailer makes sure you sleep so you won't stay awake? Why wouldn't you want to stay awake? 1, because they'll find you. At this point, he broke down into incoherent gibberish, talking about how they're going to find me too, eventually. It was around that point that Murray and I exited, deciding getting any real information was a lost cause. On our way out, we noticed 2 was having an episode of delirium, coming up to us as we tried to exit. 2, you gotta let me out of here. They're all over. They keep telling me that they're gonna rip my soul apart. Huh? One of the other subjects? The girls. The girls keep telling me they're going to rip my soul apart. They're going to eat it so they can finally leave. Murray and I were perplexed to say the least, and all I could say was, I'll see what I can do, before we walked out. Locking the door behind us and finally letting out breaths we didn't realize we were holding this whole time. It shook me. Seeing these 2 exhibiting similar symptoms, unsure of if it was the deprivation or just a shared delusion between them. My skeptic mind was telling me to discount the option that was screaming at me from the shadows, that we were messing with forces beyond our understanding. The rest of my shift passed without incident, everyone lost in their own micro-sleep states on occasion. We did run into a new issue when it came to keeping them awake, knowing that 1 was almost incapable of digesting food at this point. Not that he was really eating. The others have begun exhibiting signs of voluntary starvation, refusing food that they're given. It doesn't seem like they know what we're doing with the food, but instead, just foregoing eating on their own sense of preservation or lack thereof. I worry that we'll have an issue with malnutrition, leading to unconsciousness eventually. So we're monitoring that closely. In the meantime, we've determined we should move on to the next stage of keeping them awake. We were given access to a neurotoxin provided by the United States military. This, when applied, prevents shutdown of cognitive functions and will not allow for even microsleeps. It was essentially concentrated amphetamines in a gaseous form, which would be pumped through the room at intervals as needed. This is where things would change though, as while the gas was present, nobody was allowed in or out. To get into the room, we would have to do a total flush of the system and room's air, essentially turning it into an airlock before flooding it with oxygen again. It was complicated, but kept the rest of us safe from the potentially deadly ramifications. Taryn came back for her shift tonight, though she still looked shaken from the experience. I offered to take over for her if needed, but she said she was fine and wouldn't let herself be shaken like that again. I admire her tenacity in the face of it all, but I hope she's right. I'll be going to bed now. Hopefully things stay peaceful for a bit, because I'm exhausted. I may take some of the sleeping pills from the medical bay, assuming I can't sleep again. Day 9. Not much of a believer, but I'll thank God for letting me get an actual night of sleep. I finally felt refreshed for the first time in days, and for once, ready to face the day ahead. Taryn got through her shift fine. One would occasionally mutter something to her about her father being there, always watching over her. 2 was even more delirious than the previous day. Huddled in his room, cowering in the corner and peeking fitfully between his fingers, every so often at the doorway. 2, please make them leave. I didn't respond, trying to interact as little as possible and just see how it plays out. A burly man with questionable tattoos all over him, crying in a corner about girls being around him, was honestly the funniest thing I've seen on weeks, despite the horror of the past week surrounding it. 5 was the next one to suffer a serious break. His cool demeanor was on the decline ever since 1 and 2's confrontation the other day. Now, he was complaining that there was something burning somewhere, asking why nobody was doing anything about it. 5. Doesn't anyone else smell that? That's smoke. We're about to go up in flames in here, and they don't even care. Despite sending Murray to check out the facilities, there wasn't any fire found. Despite that, he kept complaining of the smell while moving around to every wall, trying to feel for a way out like there would be some trapdoor. 4 and 3 seemed to be having contention, each staying in an opposite corner but throwing furtive, venomous looks at each other. I don't know what their deal was, but at some point, I heard 4 ask if they would let him sleep if he killed someone for them. Whoever them was, I don't know, though he could have been referring to us. 3 complained consistently of a rotten smell, saying it smelled like bodies decaying. It's possible it could be a side effect of the gas, but the way he was complaining about it, he was convinced that he was really smelling bodies. Though how he knew what that smelled like, I don't know. He was pretty far into the throes though, and 4 seemed to be looking at him for his sacrifice to get his own peace. Most stayed in their catatonic states for the time being, passing the rest of the day without incident. 1 was still going, though not doing a whole lot. Despite the massive blood loss, he was miraculously still alive and cognitive. I'm hoping for a peaceful night of sleep again. Philip took over in a relatively good spirit, so hopefully the worst of the chaos is done. The American sleep experiment has gone straight to hell. We're trapped. Series previous day 10, I cursed us by thinking the worst was over. Everything's gone to hell again as we've reached the 10th day. Everyone else catching up to where 1 was days ago, and now showing the same signs. 4 has managed to scratch his way out of his casts, though he's no longer self-mutilating. 5 was hyperventilating in a corner, staring furtively around as he complained of the burning smell still. I didn't sleep peacefully, probably too much to ask after the past few days' events. Instead, it was fitful, with constant thoughts back to what my own mother had gone through when fighting her own insomnia. She constantly spoke about others appearing near the end, with hallucinations taking hold hard as the condition worsened. In a way, she was lucky. The disease only took a few weeks to take her after the total insomnia took hold of her and didn't suffer any of these kinds of issues. Of course, it was its own hell. Just like watching my grandfather pass from dementia years earlier, she broke down mentally and was barely my mother by the end. 5 began to scream in pain, saying that they were grabbing him all over, writhing on the floor in agony. I called Murray and Philip in, telling them we may be having a medical event, and they came rushing. I did a quick gas cycle, hoping it would clear everything before we stepped in, and we ran through the door as the room refilled with oxygen. I don't know how it happened. 5 suddenly combusted, hot flames bursting forth from his body in a raging inferno. My theory is that the sudden influx of oxygen must have led to it, but I wasn't sure where the source of the ignition could come from. Murray pulled a fire extinguisher from the outside wall, spraying him down, putting the flames out. Philip and I carried him out to the medical bay, trying to get some semblance of dressing on the wounds. They were pretty bad, skin charred, and still giving off wisps of smoke. His screams were the worst, though, like he was being tortured in the pits of hell while laying burnt before us. Despite the shock he should have been in, he was still screaming, begging us to get them off of him. "We're going to try and fix you up, okay? Did you have matches, a lighter? Anything that could have caused the fire?" 5. They grabbed me. The hands grabbed me. All of them. "Please get them off of me, please." As we stripped what remained of his clothes off, checking the extent of the awful burns, we noticed patterns different from the majority of his body. Around his ankles and wrists were handprints, or more hand indentations, with even deeper burns, nearly down to the damned bone. Everything was cauterized nearly immediately, at least the heat-searing blood vessels closed before any could escape. We bandaged him as best as we could, leaving him to lay in the medical bay, hell with keeping the gas administered. One's injuries were already giving us cold feet about the experiment, but after seeing a man spontaneously combust with nothing flammable in his reach, then seeing the awful marks of hands, I think we're seeing something much, much worse than deprivation take hold. We were shaken from each of our fearful contemplation by the sound of the gas alarm. It was getting ready to start pumping in more, alerting us to make sure the door was closed and sealed properly. We made a fatal error. Though we were successful in sealing the door on time, Murray forgot to remove the spent fire extinguisher when we carried 5 out. We only spotted it after the gas began pumping into the room, and by that time 2 saw his chance at escape. There was no way of stopping the gas cycle once it was in process, and it wouldn't stop until the sensor saw the air was totally saturated. 2 smashed the extinguisher into our observation window, breaking through it in only 3 good hits. As glass burst inward, we all shrank back to the back of the room, Philip and I shocked, both immediately aware that we were, in scientific terms, fucked. The gas would take hold quickly, and as of yet, we were only administering more as a safeguard, unsure of the efficacy and time that it would last. Whenever 2 tried crawling through the broken glass into the room, he cut himself deep on the shards, still in the windowsill. Deep cuts down his forearms gushed blood as he made his way toward us. Murray whipped a gun from his belt, pointing it right at the hulking man. He wasn't able to fire off a shot before it was snatched from his hand by an invisible force. Something determined he wouldn't be killing 2. In only moments we found out it was because whatever was there didn't want us killing him because it wanted to do the honors. A whole chunk of flesh was ripped from his neck, blood flowing from the wound and soaking any still dry parts of his filthy clothes. He screamed, but that wasn't the end of it. Before our eyes, he was knocked backward into the room, flat on his back on the tile floor. In only moments, he was spread eagle on the floor, arms and legs stretched to their limits and only being pulled further. Before long, the invisible force was pulling him like a damn drawing rack they would torture people with before electricity. The gruesome pop is something I'll hear for the rest of my life. As his limbs stretched, joints began to pop from his ankles and wrists, moving inward as elbows, knees, hips, and shoulders were pulled apart slowly, maximizing the pain he felt the entire time. The other subjects were too stunned to do anything themselves, and now we had a whole different problem. The gas sensors outside the lab were alerted, initiating a lockdown procedure. Steel shutters came down over the only exits out, with windows getting the same treatment as emergency lights began to flash on. Through the red strobing, we could see the limbs on him, two completely separate from his body, pulling off with one last sick pop before blood began flowing. An intercom came on, giving a safety announcement. Alert! Nerve agent has escaped outside of lab confinement. Please remain calm, and help will be with you shortly. That was 5 hours ago. Help hasn't come. Nobody will be either, I don't think. I've been talking to Philip and Taryn. Murray's been listening in too, and we all agree this was something planned all along. The bastards that gave us this grant and facility think they wanted a true test of their nerve gas, and they got a great sampling of people to use it on in here. Every time we try to call the emergency line we were given, even for the security guys, there's nothing. Just a canned response of, please remain calm, help will be with you shortly. If the bastards wanted to help, they would have done it by now. Looks like we're just going to be another casualty of Uncle Sam's morbid curiosity, though. Doubt we're the first. Jesus, the gas is terrible. It feels like I'm back in college, on a permanent version of the Coke and Adderall cocktail that would keep me up for a couple of days to get through finals. This was more intense, though, like an electrical wire running up my spine that kept me from sitting still. The real tell that makes me think this was part of the plan all along. There's no way to shut off the gas from in here. It's controlled by a remote output apparently, with us only allowed to do the air cycling when needed. Otherwise it goes in 10-minute intervals, though the sensor that tells it when it's saturated isn't going to make it stop anytime soon. It has to fill the entire facility now, after all. But nobody installs something like this without a kill switch if they're not planning on fucking over everyone inside. Despite mine and Murray's attempts at breaking through the door, it was useless. We tried waiting for the dinner cook to arrive, hoping they would be able to get us out of here. But it looks like they were told to take the night off. So looks like I'm dying from insomnia before my own genetics can even take me. How fun. Day 11. 2 is still alive. His wounds where arms and legs were pulled off have scabbed over, but he's definitely in insurmountable pain. 1 has left his room to watch him, saying that the girls are enjoying their retribution. He's still complaining of the kids around him, but otherwise he hadn't shown any more injuries. Maybe the injury to his skull was helping keep him safe somehow, but that's a whole other matter. All of us, the non-subjects at least, though I guess we're all subjects now, have given up on any semblance of sleep or shifts. We're trapped in here, and even if I wanted to tell anyone reading this where we were to come and rescue us, I have no fucking clue. They picked me up at the Denver airport and carted me off into nowhere, so my guess is as good as yours. They knew what they were doing. Taryn says Philip and I are paranoid for thinking it, but it makes the most logical sense. Despite the now open observation window, the subjects didn't make any effort to leave their area. Perhaps they know it's pointless, that we're compromised too, and just as unlikely to make it out. Hell, maybe their karma is that we now get to experience this hell ourselves firsthand. I'm furthest along when it comes to time awake, with my time at 3 days straight now. To be honest, it's not the worst I've gone through. The worst is that I feel tired, but I can't settle my body into any kind of sleep. It's the same electrical feeling down my spine from the gas, still constantly pumping into our air supply. And I don't think it was going at intervals anymore, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were now pumping it through the rest of the vents, making sure there was nowhere to hide. Despite the critical injuries already suffered to the subjects, we had our first deaths today. 2 of the security guards were found in their shared room, each one holding a gun with a similar bullet wound in their foreheads. Mutual suicide. Honestly, I'm jealous. I wish I had those kind of guts right now. Something was making me hang on here, though, even if it was just some kind of morbid curiosity. I might just be too numb to feel any fear of death at this point. This is probably going to become a journal now, instead of just research notes. Might as well maintain a record. People will probably consider it the ramblings of a madman, but we all know what we're seeing in here is real. Nobody will believe us, But that's probably the only thing that hasn't made them cut our internet access yet. But that was just the beginning. The real nightmare was yet to come. The trading drawer. So the end had come. $100 and a quarter, my cut of the tips for Thursday night. Not even close to what I needed to pay rent and get some food. Actual food, not pretzels and chips, for Sam, my brother. His care cost a lot. He needed to be watched at all times. Mrs. George from the lower apartment would have done it for free, but she needed to survive too. Taking care of kids in the building, and Sam, was her income. Need an advance, Charlie? Jack, owner of the Cat and Cathedral, offered. I smiled. You've already advanced me a month. I sighed and rested my chin on the bar. It's just not enough these days. I can't keep up. Can you? He shrugged. It's been slow. Times are tough all around. Can you remember a time when they weren't? I asked. Early 90s, maybe? So last century, I observed. He chuckled. Guess so. Want a drink? Yes. He poured out 2 pints. Jack didn't know I had little taste for beer. I drank it for the calories. Without these nightly freebies, I'd waste away. Cheers. We drank a few. It tasted like coppery piss, but the alcohol dulled the anxiety, or at least delayed it a little. Sober me could deal with the crushing responsibilities of life later. He indulged my prolonged loitering till just after 3. I'm off, Charlie, he said. Mind if I stick around for one more? I can lock up. Jack caught my straying glance toward the old office under the stairs, his eyes fixed on the locked door. By his order, no one was allowed in there. Only me and one other bartender had been told what it contained. And the other bartender, Tyler, was dead. You stay out of there, Jack said. What? I know. It's only trouble. Tyler died from an overdose, Jack. But if he hadn't messed with the drawer, Jack said, still watching the forbidden door, his expression pained, he never would have. I don't buy that, Jack, which is why I would never bother putting anything in there. There'd be no point. I stopped believing in magic at 10. He nodded and looked a bit teary-eyed. I wondered if I'd been too blunt. Tired and stressed 24/7, I rarely made good company. Jack had always been a friend. I won't go in there, I said. I promise. Now go home. Shannon's got to be wondering where you are, and tell her to come by every once in a while. I haven't seen her in years. Jack smiled at the mention of his wife. She's probably been asleep since 9. He said one more goodbye, spared another uneasy check of the old office door before reluctantly leaving. Like most days, this would be my only time alone. I loved Sam. He won my heart and my world. But the energy of my youth had been spent on him. Our parents were old when they had us, and not healthy. They died within a year of one another. I was 19. Sam was 12. Jack gave me a job, and more than a decade flew by. I helped myself to the house red and ate a bag of chips in a dark booth. Mrs. George had texted that Sam had fallen asleep around 8. He'd be up by 6 a.m. again. I had 3 hours. Sleep didn't call because it never did. I'm going to die if this goes on, I said to the bar, and thought of the drawer in the old office. The Cat and Cathedral had the honor of being one of the oldest piles of bricks and mortar in Bridal Veil Lake. It predated the War of 1812 and had once served as an apothecary and barber shop. Dark iron brackets for lanterns were still embedded in the beams. The fireplace was original too, though rarely lit, except on Christmas Eve for the lonely, the lost. Despite the heat of a mid-September night, I wished to build a fire so I could smell the ashes and think of better days. Tips were plentiful around the holidays. Sam and I ate well, and the rent would be paid. I don't know if I can make it to Christmas, I said. I'm tired. God, I am tired. While I cried, I poured out more wine and began to really feel the alcohol seize control. With so little food in my stomach, the beer alone had pushed me beyond a buzz. Wine gently guided me the reezy of the way to totally fucked. Shit, I said. I'm drunk. Then I laughed because it didn't matter. Drunk, sober, sleep-deprived. I'd been so long past exhausted, it couldn't get worse. You can't kill what's dead. Oh God, please help me. I thought he answered with the soft scraping of wood on wood. The noise came from the old office, and I could have convinced myself I'd imagined it if I weren't so desperate for something to go my way. Don't mess with the old office, Jack told Tyler and I years ago. I think I was 22. Tyler and I had gone in there out of curiosity. The small room didn't hold much but a broken chair and a drawer in the wall. Jack caught us as Tyler opened the drawer. "Close that shit up," Jack had yelled, and I'd never seen him so mad before. I didn't think he could get mad. He slammed shut the wide, shallow drawer and physically dragged us from the room by our aprons. Last call was hours ago that night. I remember a winter storm discouraged the trek home. Jack's hands were shaking as he struggled with an old key in the ancient lock of the office door. "What's the matter?" I asked. "What's the deal with that drawer?" Tyler ventured. "It's weird." Jack said nothing as he searched behind the bar for something strong. He came out with vodka and poured himself a shot, and then another. When he finally started to settle, he spoke quickly. "Never go in there. Don't open that drawer. And for the love of fucking Christ Almighty, don't you dare put anything in there." He stared hard at Tyler, as if he knew the far younger man could only be tempted by a warning. "The drawer goes into the wall," I said. "But there's only the outer lounge on the other side." I thought of the low ceilings in what seemed like an annex to the main room, and recalled the strange cylindrical stonework tucked into the left corner. It looked like an old-timey bread oven without an opening. I figured that's what it'd been, and that it'd been filled in at some point. "The drawer goes into that bulge in the annex. That's weird." "It's just big enough for a person to stand in," Tyler said, uncomfortably. "I don't know about any of that," Jack said, rubbing the back of his hand across his mouth. "But there's something in there, and it isn't good." Tyler laughed. Jack looked embarrassed. "What are you saying, Jack?" I asked. He glared at Tyler. "I won't talk about it anymore, except to say whatever goes in that drawer comes back out ×3. Obviously, we had no idea what he meant, and it took some persuasion and another shot to get an explanation. "So," Tyler said, more interested but no less skeptical, "if I put a loony in there, when I open the drawer, there'll be 3 loonies?" It felt like a setup for more ridicule. Jack didn't take the bait. "You can't just put money in there. Part of you goes with it. It comes back at you 3 times as hard." He leveled a finger at us both. "Promise me you'll stay out of there, right now, or you can pound sand." Whoa, for real?" Tyler asked, grinning like a child. "You're gonna fire us? Sounds like a wrongful dismissal lawsuit. Should we get a lawyer?" I promised Jack. It was important to him, so it was important to me. So does Tyler. "I do?" I dug my fingernails into his forearm. "Ouch, fuck," he expressed calmly. "Fine, I promise not to play with your magic drawers." Jack studied our faces before nodding and abruptly leaving for the night. "That guy's fucked," Tyler said. "That guy," I said, "is my friend." Okay, Tyler said. "You heading out?" "Yes," I said. "And so are you?" He grinned again. "Oh, come on, I've got to check this shit out. It's a magic drawer?" Did you see his face? Dude is scared shitless of it. "I can't not check it out. I can't." "You promised him, under the duress of your finger knives." He had a point there. I didn't believe in superstitious bullshit. Plus, I didn't see a way into the old office. Jack had the key. Tyler lacked a brain and had 0 skills outside of slinging pints and flirting with customers. "Good night," I told him for the last time. He died from a combination of drugs and exposure that night. On the way home, he passed out in a snowbank and froze to death. Jack found the old office and the drawer open. That was enough evidence for him. The trading drawer, he called it, and it had killed Tyler all of 24. I'd like to say I felt sad about Tyler's death, but I didn't feel much at all. Deep in my own troubles, I had no energy to spare on fools. Jack took it much harder. He vowed to seal that room and break the drawer, but he never did. He couldn't bring himself to go inside, and never stayed long near the old office door even. If he could have sold the bar or closed it, I think he would have. Instead, he kept his head down and drank more, and didn't talk about the drawer or Tyler except for this night. This very night I thought about it and nothing else. I needed money. I had $100 and a quarter. 375 cents would be much better. My promise to Jack and what I was about to do stung through the fatigue and withdrew guilt usually reserved for Sam. I could never do enough for my brother. I was failing him. Jack would be upset, but with a full stomach and a place to live. I owed it to Sam to try every damn thing to help us survive and more. None of these thoughts of promises and loyalty mattered, however, because the old office would be locked. Jack had the only known key. and he either had it with him or had hidden it away a long time ago. Before my drunken brain could catch up, I found myself in front of the solid wood door, with my hand over the brass knob. Only a slight effort worked the mechanism. The door swung open noiselessly, and the lack of sound seemed to mute everything but the pulse of blood in my ears. The drawer across the room stood open from the wall. I had no doubt the subtle, gentle scraping I'd heard before had been its invitation. I don't believe it, I don't. But I need it to work. I'm desperate. Please don't kill me. Sam needs me alive. I put all the money into the worn bottom of the drawer. I'm not sure what I expected, but nothing happened. I closed it up and waited. Please, I whispered. Please. It was a prayer, though I don't believe in God. In the quiet of the cavity within the sealed wall, something whispered back. I couldn't hear much, and what I could make out didn't sound like English. It didn't sound nice either. The drawer shuddered as if heavy hands gripped it from the other side. Scratching noises were rapid and couldn't be denied. What was given was taken. When the scratches ended, the drawer shuddered once again before smoothly presenting the very thing I desired and feared. $300.75. Instead of the astonishment and fear you might expect someone to have when they see the vaguely sinister and utterly impossible occur, I experienced more of a "it's about damn time" moment. It was about damn time Sam and I caught a break. It was about damn time the universe shed its casual indifference toward us. And it was about damn time I decided to stop settling for the first offer and the meager existence only scraps could provide. I shoved the drawer back in. Whispered chittering sounded like stifled laughter. The drawer returned, full of cash. Too drunk to do math, I dragged enough stacks onto the floor until I could do it all again. Each trade seemed to increase the elation of whatever thing existed in the wall. I don't know how much time went by, maybe an hour, but its laughter bellowed raucously as the money piled up around my knees. The sun would rise soon. I needed to get home to Sam. Or I could keep doing this and make an escape around 9 when Jack would inevitably start thinking about coming in to ready the bar for lunch. A few more hours of trading and I'd never have to work or worry again. So I kept going. More. How could I carry so much money home? It didn't matter. I'd figure out a way. I always did. Sam and I could never have enough. With the fortune I had made, we'd be fine for groceries and a place to live. But what about his education? His protection? I wouldn't be around forever. What would become of Sam if I died? Moi. The drawer and I became rhythmic in our back and forth. More. And what about the zillion other threats that never crossed my wearied mind? I'm no genius. I only knew people with money never seemed to have problems they couldn't pay away. More. I felt sick as the alcohol wore off and the inevitable hangover took hold. Sweat coated my body. My clothes were soaked through. I couldn't stop. I would never stop. For Sam, there were evil things in the world. Evil people. Monsters. They'd hurt Sam for fun if they could. I'd read a story about a mentally ill man staked out on a hardwood floor and tortured for months, burned and made to eat feces by drug addicts. They killed him and were caught tossing his cut-up body in the gorge. It could so easily be Sam, back and forth and sweep the cash above the lip of the drawer. Jack could be in any second. But there were horrors beyond imagination too. Darkness beyond human comprehension that nevertheless interacted and opposed human beings. It had to be true. One existed within the wall, laughing, always laughing every time I made another trade. If one lived inside the wall, there could be others. There were likely others. And where were they? Not in the open, no, but in the dark, the shadows in the corners of the room. When I risked a glance, an indistinct shape, black as oil and huge, shifted enough to reveal two horns the same as a bull's but larger. I pulled the drawer out and finally hesitated to push it back in. What was this monster? What did it want? How could I kill it and others like it? I'd need more money to know, to pay people to research and study and make new weapons or find holy relics. Yes, I decided, more money could solve even this demon. I screamed against my growing apprehension and continued trading. Peals of laughter shattered my already fragile resolve and extracted a stream of tears that blurred my vision. What happened next? I'm not entirely sure. Footsteps came from behind, shuffling through the mounds of bills. Screams and curses reached my ears, but not my mind. It could have been the strange language of the entity pushing the drawer, or another obfuscated monster, more daring than the rest, coming to end the seemingly endless task I had made for myself. I collapsed under the impact of something heavy, crashing against the back of my neck. I felt awake. I could hear the laughter echoing, but I couldn't see. I had blacked out, I thought, until I saw one of those things stir just a little to prove it was there. Then they all did. Hundreds of them had collected on the ceiling and everywhere the light did not go. But I knew. I was right. There were monsters everywhere, and they hated me and Sam and every bit of life. I needed more. I couldn't move. Charlie! Charlie! Another impact made a searing pain in my cheek. Charlie! Whack! Where was I? Pinpoints of light grew like the end of a train tunnel. I could see again, but I couldn't move. He tied me to a chair with an apron. Charlie! Jack shouted. We were in the lounge. I tasted blood. My nose hurt and my head. Jack? What are you? I tried to wiggle against the apron strings. What time is it? Sam? I have to get home. Jack stared and sucked on a cigarette, casually releasing plumes of smoke from his nostrils. He looked like a man on the cusp of some decision. Why didn't you listen, Charlie? Why does no one listen? The hours spent in the old office, the money, felt like a nightmare. I would have liked to dismiss it as such, but the currency behind Jack, organized neatly, confirmed the reality and something more, something wrong. Jack, untie me. It's tough times, Charlie, he apologized. Tougher than you know. Shannon would kick your ass right now, I seethed. The apron strings were tight. I had to get away. Shannon hasn't been well, Jack continued. That's why she stopped coming around. I think you can guess how she got that way. It's crazy how alike you two are. You could be her daughter. My daughter. Hell, I wish you were. He shook his head to rid himself of a pained expression. Shannon used the drawer, I said, only to get him to keep talking while I strained. She did, he confirmed. Used it the same way you did. Neither of us understood what the hell it was until too late. You get back everything you put in, threefold, every dollar, every feeling, all the anxiety and worry attached to the false hope in that fucking thing in there. He dropped his cigarette into a coffee cup and wiped his hands on his shirt. And now you'll never be the same. Let me go, Jack, I said. I'm sorry I used the drawer, but whatever you're thinking. His face scrunched up. Let you go? I'm not keeping you here. You are. What? I didn't understand. My hands are tied. You. Jack reached for the back of the chair and like a magician swept the apron away. I felt the loose strings glide against my skin, yet my body still felt bound. What? What the hell? Why? What the fuck? All of your exhaustion, Jack said, returned threefold. He hadn't tied me up. I'd been put into a chair with an apron slung over the back. I was weak, too weak to hold my body weight. Oh shit. It's worse than you think, Jack said. Your mind is shot. Shannon's is. Oh God. Oh God. I'm amazed you can talk. Shannon only started talking again last year, a little. He rubbed his shoulder. But then she did a bit afterwards, too, I guess. His words were like a spell. My tongue became heavy, clumsy. Jack nodded. It's gonna get worse. The good news is I'll take care of you. Sem. Your brother, I'm sorry, Charlie. There's nothing I can do for him. You gave your anxiety over Sam, and it took it how many times? How many times did you use the drawer? Hundreds for sure. Unfortunately, he said, trying to be gentle, the thing in there deals with its concerns quite differently than you or I. Sam there's no hope. It'll only be a matter of time. I cried, but could manage nothing more. Jack packed up the cash into hockey bags that seemed reserved for the opportunity. He'd done this before, maybe after Shannon, and what the hell had gone on with Tyler? I never got the chance to ask. He carried me to his truck and drove me to his place. That's where I am. That's where I typed these words from a mattress on the floor in the basement. He never took my phone away. He's taken good care of me. Shannon lies beside me and sings a few lullabies to us, the others Jack brought home. There's half a dozen here, emaciated by the weakness we thought we were alleviating. I know a few of them. Waitresses I thought moved on to other jobs. A bouncer Jack said we didn't need from way back. No one can walk. Few can manage words at all. Only Shannon, the earliest victim of the drawer, can get out of bed and use the bathroom on her own. She usually sleeps after. We all do. We sleep and wait for Jack and pray the lights stay on because they are there, all around us. Once, the power went out, and our soft, whispered screams were a tormented choir of panic and despair. The demons in the dark, Shannon named them. We don't know what they want or why they stay. Jack thinks our use of the drawer drew other malevolent entities that wait for us to die. I think you belong to the one in the wall, he said over a bowl of soup he was feeding me. But maybe once you're gone, they can do something. I groaned my dissatisfaction with this observation. He apologized but explained, keeping nothing from us, that before I came to his basement, another user of the drawer had died in the bed I currently occupied. When she expired, Jack said he thought he saw something happening around her body. Like a subtle change in light, he said, nearly translucent smoke. He shrugged. Or maybe I imagined it. Maybe all our minds are cracked, or cracking in my case in the same way, and there are no creatures in the dark at all. We've all gone mad with a kind of precision. Of course, I don't see them, but the death of... And he talked on to fill the constant silence in the room. I found out about Sam from Jack. The article said he disappeared from care, just walked out the door. His tortured and burned remains could only be identified by his clothing and eventual dental records. He was found in the gorge, no killer arrested. I'll let you know if there's more, Jack told me. I cried, and I cry every day for Sam. For what I did to him. It's taken years to type this. I can manage a few words at a time. More recently, I gained the use of my left hand. So I posted, because there's nothing more to do except exist, maybe as a cautionary tale. Don't be so quick to give in to fantasies of relief from your problems. At best, you'll only exchange your worries for new ones, and it won't be a fair trade in the end. Or maybe I don't know anything, and you can figure out a way to make a deal with demons that won't destroy everything you love or kill you. Jack says he's going to sell the Catton Cathedral after Christmas. If you thought that was terrifying, wait until you hear what happened next. The Bean Jar Dad was always kind of a weird guy, weird and strict. I always thought this was just because he was a single parent, but even that seemed to only barely cover his odd behavior. He expected the best of me. Expected my chores to be done, expected the rules to be followed, and if I didn't, there was only one punishment that would do. Dad never hit me with a belt, he never spanked me with his hand, he never took my stuff or put me in timeout. No, Dad had a different sort of punishment he used. He didn't introduce the jar until I was 6, and it was revealed with a lot of serious contemplation. I remember coming home from my first day of kindergarten and finding my dad sitting in the living room, the jar on the little end table where the magazines and rickrack usually stood. The jar may have begun life as a pickle jar. It always smelled a little of brine, and inside were beans. These were spotted pinto beans, the kind I had used on art projects and crafts since before I could remember, and I noticed they had been filled up to the brim. All in all, there were probably about 3 bags of beans in there, and a piece of Scotch tape declared it to be my jar. "Take a seat, we need to have a very serious talk," he said, and I ended up just sitting on the floor of our living room and looking up at him. He looked very serious, more serious than I had ever seen him before, and that scared me a bit. Up until now, Dad had always been this goofy guy who played pirates and astronauts and Mario Kart with me. But now he looked like a judge ready to sentence me to death if I didn't have a pretty good defense for my crime. "You are 6 now, long past knowing right from wrong. In this family, it is customary to use the bean jar to punish children." "Do you see this jar?" he asked like there was any way I could miss it. I nodded, and he smiled, seeming pleased. "The bean jar symbolizes you. It is everything you are and everything you might be. So, from now on, when you are bad or insolent or you disobey my orders, I will not yell at you or send you to your room. I won't do anything but take a bean from the bean jar." I almost laughed. Was this a game or something? Was I supposed to be scared of a jar of beans? This had to be another one of Dad's jokes. Dad was always doing stuff like this, telling me how the monsters in my closet could be kept away by a teddy bear, or that the cavity creeps would eat my teeth if I didn't brush them twice a day. Dad was a goofball. He always had been, but I think it was his face that made me wonder if he was joking or not. Throughout the whole thing, he just sat there, deadly serious, and never averted his eyes from me. You're a smart kid, just like I was, and I see now that you'll need an example. You may think this is just a regular jar, but you're wrong, he said, reaching in and picking up a bean. Dead wrong. He didn't even take it out. He just lifted a little, hovering it over the pile, but he didn't need to do anything else. Suddenly, miraculously, it felt like someone was touching my brain. It was the feeling of getting a sudden sadness, a sudden bit of anxiety, and I wanted him to drop that bean back in the jar. I needed to be whole. I needed all my beans, and he must have seen that on my face because he dropped it back in, and I trembled as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I'm sorry, but you have to know what's at stake here. You're my last chance. I have to make sure that you are perfect, and the bean jar knows perfection from flaw. My own father used this method, and his father before him. The bean jar is always used until the child's 18th birthday, or until all the beans are gone. I was panting when I asked him what would happen if all the beans were gone. He looked at me without mirth and without any sign of a joke or a goof. You don't want to know. That's how we started with the bean jar. Dad didn't suddenly turn into an ogre or become a villain overnight. He went back to being the same guy he'd always been. We would play video games together, build with my Legos, and play pretend after school. My dad had never scared me like that before. He and I were always really close, but I remember how he would get when he had to take beans out of the jar. His face would become completely neutral, and he would walk to the jar and take out a bean before crushing it between his thumb and forefinger. The bean jar was utilized even for the most trivial of infractions. Forgot to wash my dishes? Lose a bean. Forgot to put my clothes away? Lose a bean. Stayed up too late on a school night? Lose a bean. There was no escalation either. There was never any difference between forgetting to clean up my toys or yelling at Dad because I was frustrated. It was always one bean at a time, ground to dust between his large, calloused fingers. He would look at me too with this mixture of pain and resolve once it was done, his stoicism only going so far. Those times he took a bean, however, were unbearable. It felt as if each bean were a piece of my psyche that he was turning to dust. As a child, every bean made me hyper-aware of my actions, but I was still just a child. Sometimes I forgot things, sometimes I was lazy, and sometimes I thought I could sneak around and get away with not doing what I was told. I was always caught, always punished, and I always fell into a state of anxious, nervous emotions once it was done. I hated the way it felt when he crushed those beans, and I didn't want to lose another one. I didn't want to lose them so badly that I trained myself to perform the tasks expected of me without fail. 5 a.m., start the laundry. 5:20, make breakfast. 5:30, wash my dishes. 5:40, dress. 6 o'clock, clean up my room. 6:30, backpack on, fully dressed, waiting by the door to leave. 3:10, get home, do homework. 4:30, clean house. 5, start dinner. 6, eat dinner when my father got home. 9 o'clock, brush teeth, take a shower. 9:30, bedtime. Every day, without fail, these things were done or I would be one bean shorter. This manifested itself as a kind of mania in me. Not only did I have to get all my chores done, but I needed to get good grades too. After a while, good wasn't good enough either. What if Dad decided that C's and B's weren't good enough? I strove for all A's, and Dad seemed happy with my efforts. To the other kids, however, I was a weirdo, and I didn't really have any friends. Dad was my only friend, but it was a strange kind of friendship, like living with someone who has schizophrenia and could change at the slightest inclination. I didn't have any real friends until high school when I met Cass. Cassandra Bigley was not what you would consider a model student. Her parents had high expectations for her, but she was a middling at best. She came to me because I was the smartest kid in school, at least according to the other kids, and she begged me to help her. I helped her, tutored her, showed her the way, and soon her grades improved. That was how we became friends, and how she was the first to find out about the bean jar. So, he just takes a bean out and crushes it? Yes, I said, not sounding at all mystified about the process. And? What? It means you have less beans? I thought about it. Dad had never actually told me what would happen, only that it would be terrible. When he takes out all the beans, then something awful will happen. Like what? Cass asked. No dessert for a month? I don't know, but I know that when he crushes those beans, it's like a piece of my sanity is mushed. I feel crazy after he smushes a bean. I don't like feeling that way. I don't like it at all. I started crying. I hadn't meant to. I was 16, and I never cried anymore. But Cass didn't make me feel bad about it. She just held me while I cried, and eventually, I stopped. It had felt good to be held. Dad hugged me, but he never really comforted me. I didn't have a mom, someone whose job seemed to be comforting me. And as Cass held me, I realized what I had been missing all these years. I had been missing a mom that I had never even known. We hung out a lot after that, Cass and I. Despite our age, it never became inappropriate. She gave me something I had been missing, a friend without the threat of punishment looming over our relationship. The realization made me feel differently about my dad. He was still the lovable goofball that he had always been, but I started to see how our entire relationship hung under the shadow of that bean jar. As I pulled away, he became more sullen and more suspicious, and I saw him holding the bean jar sometimes as if he wished to smash them. If I wasn't misbehaving, though, he couldn't. That was always the deal. He knew it, I knew it, and he knew that as long as I abided by the rules, he couldn't punish me. Despite how it will sound, Dad was never cruel about the bean jar. He never used it to take out his frustrations. He never came home and punished me simply because he'd had a bad day. The rules were established, we had both agreed to them, and I knew that by following them, I would be safe. I think, deep down, Dad really did think he was doing the best for me, thought he was molding me into something better than I could be. And I guess he was right, though it wasn't fair. Not really. Then, one day after coming home from Cass's, it all came to a head. Dad was supposed to be at work, so Cass and I came back to the house to play video games. She had never even seen a Super Nintendo, and she wanted to play some Mario Kart with me. We had come in, laughing and making jokes, when someone cleared their throat loudly, sending a chill up my spine and turning me slowly to find my dad sitting on the couch. He looked so much like he had the day he introduced the bean jar, and he was wearing that look of pain and resolve. You come home late, your chores aren't done, your homework is undone, and you have brought someone here without permission. Why have you decided to break the rules like this? I saw the hammer come down on the table, but I hadn't realized what he'd done until then. It turned the bean he had laid there to smithereens, and I shuddered as I gripped my head and moaned. If he noticed, he made no comment. He just brought the hammer down on another one, and I nearly vomited as a pain like no other went through me. He had lined up 4, one for each infraction, but he had never done anything like this. It had always been one at a time, and that had been bad enough. This, however, was unbearable. "Stop it," Cass yelled. "Whatever you're doing to him, stop." But he cut her off. He grabbed her under the arm and heaved her toward the door. "This is your fault. You've changed him, made him forget his purpose, but I won't let you kill him. You aren't allowed in this house, never again, and I." "Put her down," I growled, finding my feet, weaving only a little. "You will not touch her." My father looked at me, not believing what he was hearing. "Put her down now," I repeated, stepping up close and getting in his face. "You dare? You dare to challenge me? You're no different than the rest. I tried to raise you better, but it appears I was a fool. I'll smash every damn bean in that jar if I have to. When all the beans are gone, you'll cease to exist. I'll smash every damn bean in that jar, just to prove, but he never finished. He let go of the hammer as he clutched at his chest, and it fell from his grip as he gasped and beat at his shirt front. His face had gone from red to purple, and before he hit the floor it was nearly black. I just stood there for a moment, listening to Cass beat at the door and ask what was wrong. I couldn't answer. I just stood there, feeling like I was suffocating, as the realization that my father was dead fell across me. That was 2 years ago. I've been living with Cass since then, her parents taking me in gladly. Cass and I are getting ready for college, and that's when I remembered the house. It's still there, still sitting on the same lot, and I decided that it might be good to sell it so I can pay tuition. There were things inside as well. I've been back there a few times to get things. And I knew my father's room was essentially untouched. The police hadn't bothered to search the place. Dad's death was no mystery, after all, and they had decided he had died of a heart attack and saved me a lengthy interrogation. I started cleaning it out as summer began, selling what I could and donating what I couldn't. I found pictures of my dad and I, taken in better times, and far too soon I had cleaned out everything and was left with only my father's room. I paused at the door, almost feeling like a burglar when I thought of going in there, but finally decided this was my house now, and this room was as good as mine. The room was Spartan, a bed and a dresser and a closet, but it was what I found inside it that took me by surprise. 5 jars, each of them bearing a different name: Jacob, Mark, Sylvester, Katie, and James. They were empty, the lids gone, and the taped-on names made them look exactly like mine. What the hell was this? Who were these people? I didn't know any of them, and no one but Dad and I had ever lived in the house. It had always been the two of us, always just... No, that couldn't be true, because my mother had once lived with us. There in the back was a 6th jar, the glass broken, but the tape intact. Maggie. When the beans are gone, I heard Dad's voice echo in my head, then you cease to exist. Had the names on those jars been real people? Had I lived with them and simply didn't remember them? How could you remember people who never existed? I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of it all, and finally decided to write all this before it grew unclear. Apparently Dad wasn't as crazy as I might have thought, and maybe I should have been more respectful of the bean jar. It sits on the shelf in my dorm room now. I took it from the house before I sold it, and I guard it jealously. I don't know if it still works the same now that Dad is dead, but I'm not taking any chances. As one tale ends, another, more sinister story begins. I am the new landlord of a village. Something there wants to kill me. Okay, I think this needs a bit more context. You wouldn't know it if you saw me walk down the street, but my family owns a village. This village is somewhere in Bengal, but I won't tell you where, for reasons that will quickly become clear. My ancestors were given the zamindari, or feudal rights, over the settlement by the Pala kings all the way back in the 11th century. Yes, it's been a heck of a long time. What did we do to deserve this honor, you ask? Well, there isn't a simple answer to that. Kings used to give away lands and villages for practically anything back in the day, from marrying the princess to curing the prince of an illness to bringing over the neighboring king's head. I haven't had the time or the inclination to rifle through what little family chronicles have survived to find out which one we did. I live miles away from that place anyway. In Kolkata, my father left the ancestral manor in the care of my grandfather and his brothers and moved away with his family when I was barely learning to open my eyes. Since then, I have only visited Chayagar a total of 5 times. That's the name of the village, by the way. Chayagar. The last time I visited the village, I was 10 years old. My father was still alive then. My memories are dim, given that it was more than a decade ago, but I remember the important details. I remember my grandfather's glowing face as he sunned himself in his recliner, watching me play with the weeds in the courtyard. I remember his hefty walking stick, and enjoying the loud clacks it made as he walked around the corridors. I remember Ram Lal, the manservant, chasing me around the backyard to force me into taking a bath. I remember my grandmother's delicious cooking on my tongue. I remember other things too. The pale lady in a white sari smiling at me from the parapet of the boundary wall. The unnaturally tall man whispering to my grandfather in his study, his broad-brimmed hat scraping the ceiling. He had turned briefly to smile at me. His face had nothing on it save the grinning mouth. I remember the shaggy thing I used to play fetch with near the family grove, built like a dog, but not quite. I remember my father sending me back to my room with a harsh noise, old rifle in hand, before joining a small group of villagers with flaming torches and wooden staves at the front gate at midnight. There is something off about Chayagar. I can't find a better way to explain it. It is a normal village with all the trappings you would expect. Playing children, women with water pots, charming little trees and huts. But alongside that world, there is another world that lives there. A world many of us would rather not acknowledge. That world was somehow centered around us. Each time my father took us there, something was always happening. Villagers filtering in and out to confer with the family, mounds of dusty books and manuscripts lying open on tables, weapons being brought out and maintained. Each of these buildups would inevitably have a climax. A loud struggle at midnight, gunshots in the forest, a massive ritual bonfire in the atrium, or something similar. I never saw these climaxes. Everyone made sure to give me a wide berth whenever funny business was involved. After everything was over, my father would pack us up, and we would be back in Kolkata, none the worse for the wear. The last time we went there, it was different. I was too young to ask questions, but something went wrong. That night, my father returned 3 hours later, his face white as a sheet. He was alone and without his gun. He said nothing. He did nothing. He merely went into a room with my mother and my grandfather and closed the door. 15 minutes later, my mother came to put me to bed as usual. I am pretty sure she said nothing out of the ordinary, but there were streaks of tears running down her face. The next morning, we packed our bags and returned to Kolkata. 2 days later, there was an accident. 30 cars piled up on the road. Only one casualty. Even at the cremation, my mother said nothing. She only cried silently as she handed me the torch and let me burn my father's mangled corpse to ashes. We haven't been back to Chayagar since. In fact, she has actively kept me away from visiting, despite more than 100 letters from my grandparents, old-fashioned people. Apparently, they never could figure the telephone out. Not that I'm complaining. Without the rose-tinted glasses of childhood, it was kind of a shitty place anyway. The land was dry and hard, and the villagers struggled to farm in the best of weather. The water table was deep and stony, and the nearest well was over 2 miles from the manor. The servants had the near-constant duty of running pots of water to the house for cooking and cleaning. I'm pretty sure there still isn't a mobile tower, bank, or post office in the entire block. In hindsight, the only thing that made it worth it was the pure joy on my grandfather's face whenever he saw us. But that can only take you so far. My life in Kolkata is good. I just finished my law degree, and a career in litigation looks to be on track, though my senior still insists that 5,000 rupees is plenty of money to live on for a month. I'm not sure he has purchased anything since the 50s. My mother is running a successful interior decoration business, so that helps with the finances. My father also left behind a decent estate, and for all our neglect, my grandparents do not skimp on sending over the revenue from the property. I dimly knew that I was going to come into the zamindari eventually, given that my father was no longer in the picture, but it was not something I really thought about. In any case, I was planning to pawn the damn place off to the first feudal enthusiast I met with more money than sense. Chayagar did not feature in my top 50 priorities list. Until yesterday. This time, the letter that came did not bear my grandfather's characteristically elegant handwriting on the envelope. It was the harsh, angular script of a lawyer, just in case the starched brown envelope did not make the official nature of the communication clear enough. Apparently, our family has an estate manager. He was writing to tell me that my grandfather was dead. There were no details as to how, just strict business. In accordance with ordinary rules of succession, the zamindari should devolve to one of my uncles, but my grandfather had made his wishes clear. The family customs had to be followed. The land in the village must pass to his firstborn son, my father, and through him to his firstborn son, me. He had also insisted that I come to the village immediately and take charge of the manor and the surrounding properties. The estate lawyer would meet me there and hand over some articles he had bequeathed to me. I had sole and absolute ownership over the ancestral house, but he had requested that I allow my grandmother, my uncles, and their families to continue their residence on the premises and take care of their needs. When I showed my mother the letter, I was expecting she would say what was already on my mind. Toss the letter in the bin, surrender the property to some relative, or, failing that, the government, and go on with my life in peace. Instead, she sighed, put the letter face down on the table, and asked, "When are you leaving?" "What?" was all I could say. "Chayagar. When are you going over to take possession?" "Mom, are you serious? That place is a dump. I have no interest in role-playing a medieval landlord in some godforsaken hamlet in the middle of nowhere. I have a career here. We have a business here." She sighed. I wish I could have kept you here forever, but I can't. You have to go. Our family must take up the mantle. It is our duty to Chayagar, to our ancestors, to ourselves. Go. I paused. That place killed my father. I'm not going. I'm going to write to the lawyer. And Chayagar killed your father, and it killed your grandfather. Grandfather? How can you be so sure? It killed him, just as it has killed many of your ancestors before him. I know it, somewhere inside me, just as your father knew that day. He knew he was going to die. He could not keep winning, but he did his duty, just as you will, because if you don't, Chayagar will kill many more. I leaned forward and grasped her hands in my own. Mom, you're not telling me something. What do you know? Not enough. Only they can explain it to you, those who have lived on the land and worked with it. But I know this. There was a reason your family, our family, was given that land. No, a reason they were placed upon that land. It wasn't wealth or favor or martial skill that won us Chayagar. It was something else. Something to do with them, the others. You know of what I speak. Her hands trembled in mine. You must go. She would say no more after this, only insisting that I go, and that all will be clear once I reach the manor and take over affairs. I will be frank. After this conversation, my desire to go to Chayagar had only lessened. But right now, I am in a rattling bus, traveling through territory that I'm pretty sure does not exist on any map you have access to, on a road you will probably never see. A road that leads to Chayagar. I am here because of what happened last night. We were finalizing some pleadings for filing, so I left my chamber well after midnight. No, there was no overtime pay. The journey home was a blur, as was changing, brushing my teeth, and collapsing on the bed. My mother was already sleeping like the dead. She had long learned that staying up waiting for me was too regular of an occurrence to be healthy. The first thing I remember is waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. Now, Kolkata does get hot, but not moisten the bed with sweat hot. I sleepily grabbed my phone off the bedside table and checked the time. 2 a.m. With an internal groan, I started drifting off again, but then I noticed that the crack at the bottom of my bedroom door was awash with light. That was strange. My mother never turned on the lights, even if she woke up in the middle of the night. To add to that, this light was a soft and diffuse yellow, nothing like the harsh white glare of the hallway LEDs. Hesitantly, I swung my legs off the bed, feeling for my slippers, even as I dragged the shirt over my head. Then I softly padded over to the door and opened it. There was no longer a hallway on the other side. Instead, a dozen candles illuminated a cozy little room with bookshelves wrapping around the walls. Small wooden tables held more piles of books and papers, and a larger one had a topographical map spread out, multicolored pins poking out here and there. A few roughly bound manuscripts and diagrams were also strewn haphazardly across the floor. In the farthest corner, there was a little writing table decorated with ornate sigils and floral designs. Somehow, my bedroom had opened onto my grandfather's study. The man himself was hunched over the writing table, scribbling absent-mindedly on parchment with a gilded pen. At this point, I was sure I was dreaming. Nevertheless, I tried to be quiet as I walked over to him, carefully stepping around the papers on the floor. Despite his age, his burly frame filled the chair, muscles bulging through the thin tunic he wore. Though he had lost tone with age, a lifetime of hard work had made him an incredibly strong man. His walking stick leaned against one of the armrests, the knotted head glinting slightly in the firelight. A rimless pair of spectacles perched at the very tip of his nose as he peered down at his writings, occasionally stopping to consult one of the many open books on the table. I slowly reached out and touched his arm. It felt solid and fleshy, real, but he did not react at all, continuing his work. Definitely a dream then. Babu? The voice came from the door I had just come through. I turned to see a gaunt, fit man standing in the doorway, hands clasped at his waist. His dark hair was cropped short, and he sported a thin, well-groomed mustache. He was bare-chested and wore a faded white dhoti with a coarse cotton gamcha around his neck. I did not know this man, but I would know the attire anywhere. It was the attire of a traditional village manservant. My grandfather turned in his chair. Yes, Banu? The servant's eyes darted from side to side, unsure. He is here, Babu. Should I show him in? He has never come this late in the night. The tall one? Yes. Should I send him away like last time? He's being insistent. No, Banu. I was the one who invited him. Show him in. Yes, Babu. Banu nervously twisted his gamcha before walking out. A few seconds later, a figure came through the door, bowing his head and shoulders to fit. It was clad in a long cloak that fell down from its shoulders to its feet, covering its form entirely. A broad hat covered its head, the shadow hiding its face from view as well. It slowly stalked over, keeping its head bowed to avoid touching the whitewashed ceiling, until it stood right behind my grandfather. He kept his back turned to the entity, lazily continuing his scribbling. Thakur. My grandfather gave no response. Thakur. The entity's voice was thick and heavy, but still intelligible. I agreed to see you because you were so persistent, my friend, but it is not like you to waste time looking for my attention. My grandfather paused to look at one of the books. Speak. Thakur. Do not go today. The omens are not right. The trees are restless. The birds sing of doom. Do not go. If you came to stop me, you have come in vain. It must be tonight. You know that. The forest is not safe tonight. Even with your weapons, your men, and your rituals, success is barely possible, and you choose to go alone. I cannot risk the others for this. This is my duty to the land, my burden to bear. To punctuate his point, my grandfather stabbed his pen into the paper, leaving a large dot in the middle of the design he was drawing. Thakur, you are brave, like your father was brave, like his father was brave, but you are also wise. Listen to me. There will be other times, other nights. Tonight, you will die. If that is what it takes. The entity rumbled, its cloak ripping as a long whitish hand appeared. It opened its clenched fist over the table, depositing some small pebble-like things in front of my grandfather. I leaned over to see. They were human teeth, flecked with dried blood and bits of gum. I recoiled, my stomach lurching. This dream was steadily turning into something of a nightmare. It has begun its hunt. Its power waxes with the rising of the moon. If you go, you will die, and you will fail. Go tomorrow, and you will say the same thing tomorrow. Grandfather brushed the teeth into one little pile to the side, unfazed. If so, you will try the day after tomorrow, or the day after that. No, for the first time he raised his voice. It cannot be tomorrow. If I don't go today, it will attack. It is ready. You know that. The village, my family, nothing will be safe. The entity was silent for a few seconds. Yes, it is ready. That is true. If I win, that is another curse off the land for a few centuries. If I lose. He opened one of the drawers on the table, producing a small glass vial. I can slow it down at least. Buy some time. For whom? Him? I have faith in my grandson. If anyone can figure out a way, he will. He is the next lord, after all. After my son. He paused again. I cannot lose again, but if I do, help him. I have seen the boy, Thakur. He knows nothing of our ways, and he does not have time to learn. If you fail, have faith, old friend. We must have faith. In these times we have little else. Grandfather sighed, resuming his drawing again. If there is nothing else, the entity made a deep noise that reverberated in my chest, a sigh. Then it removed its hat, revealing a smooth white head devoid of hair or ears. It had no marks or blemishes, just a smooth, bulbous mass, at least from the back. As I looked at his bare skin, my limbs grew heavy. My head erupted in a dull migraine, and my knees knocked, threatening to buckle. A primal chill settled in the pit of my stomach. As you wish, Thakur. I will pray I see you again. If not, I will honor my promise. The young lord will be safe with me. My grandfather chuckled, despite the heavy sense of dread that was beginning to permeate the air. Pray? You? We have gods of our own, though you would not term them as such. The entity chuckled, its skin rippling like water. Good luck. It put its hat on again and slowly backed out of the room without turning its back. Even after it was out of view, the cold terror remained. With a jolt, I realized I was sweating again. Was this normal for dreams? Or was this a nightmare? Did it matter? Either way, it was time to go. I slowly backed away, out of the doorway and back to my bedroom. But my bedroom was no longer there. Instead, I was in our ancestral manor, the hallways dark and cold. The village did have electricity, but power was unreliable at best. That was probably why the study was lit by candles. But outside, the servants had neglected to light the many oil lamps hanging on hooks around the house. I still wanted to believe this was a dream. But the familiar chill of the midnight air, the distant smells of the land, the feel of the hard marble against my feet, and much more made that incredibly difficult to believe. My doubts were fully and finally erased when an ice-cold hand grabbed my wrist from behind. "You are far from your proper time, little lord." The hand slowly but firmly turned me around. The cloaked entity towered over me. This close, the radiating sense of dread was almost overpowering, settling into my veins like frost and chilling my blood. My heart pounded like a rabid dog, but otherwise time refused to flow. A prickling sensation began to grow out of its grip, turning the skin dead and numb as it grew. I dared not look down at its hand, my eyes stuck on the hat covering its face. "You ought to be more careful. Not everyone will be as charitable as I when dealing with trespass of this magnitude." With its other hand, it removed its hat. Like the back of its head, its face was completely featureless, except for a mouth, a wide, grinning mouth showing off straight white teeth. "But then again, you are not here by choice, are you? You are incapable of that. For now." Its mouth did not move when it spoke, the voice merely echoing in my ears. I could not even shake in fear. My muscles refused to obey me. My legs started to crumple, but his immovable grip somehow held me upright, like a puppet propped up by strings. "Either way, you must go back. Mortals cannot be stuck in time. Very harmful, even for one from your bloodline." It bent down, leaning its head forward until he was close enough to kiss. "Would you like to go back now, little lord?" My teeth were clenched so hard I was afraid they might break. But even through the haze of fear, I managed to give him a jerky nod. This close, its skin gave off the smell of rotting flesh and sickly decay. Its grin widened even further at my ascent, impossibly further, stretching around the sides of his head and around to the back until his mouth formed a continuous band around his head. "See you soon, Thakor." His head split open like a box, the top tilting back to reveal a pitch-black maw. He continued to lean, beginning to swallow me from top to bottom. My heart was trying to break through my ribcage and flee, but I was otherwise paralyzed, only watching helplessly as the darkness swallowed my vision. And then my hearing. Then my sense of smell went, and then finally all sensation disappeared as he let go of my wrist. I could only feel one thing, the dim pressure of his hands around my waist as he tilted his head back again, pushing me into his gullet. His mouth was warm and heavy, more like a weighted blanket than a body cavity. But as the top of his head sealed around my legs, all sensation returned, just in time for the void to begin pressing in on me in undulating waves, growing needle-like teeth that stabbed and tore at my flesh. As the creature chewed, I began to scream. Then the maw closed in, crushing my bones like twigs with one final squeeze. When I woke up in my bed, the light of early morning shining outside, I was still screaming, but I was intact and mercifully unchewed. In fact, I could have passed off the whole thing as a bad dream, even when my mother burst into my room and demanded to know why I was screaming loud enough for them to hear me in Delhi. Instead, I packed 2 light suitcases, made excuses with my chamber, bid my mother goodbye, caught a cab to a bus terminus, and bought a ticket for Chayagar. Because, though no other mark from last night remains, it is very difficult to ignore the raw, red skin around my wrist, especially when it is in the shape of an abnormally large hand. The bus I am on right now is an overnight route. The vehicle is almost empty, with only 5 passengers beside me. They all seem to be non-locals. Backpackers, probably. One of them appears to be European, while the others are Indian like me. The driver pays them no mind, but for some reason, he keeps looking at me in the rearview mirror. He says nothing, does nothing, and does not stare for too long. But I could have sworn that, at least once or twice, when I met his gaze, his eyes were dark voids, interspersed with glittering stars. Then again, getting eaten does tend to make you a little tired, so who knows what I'm seeing. I wanted to be a reasonably successful litigator. Instead, I'm now on my way to claim a zamindari that's about 10 centuries old. I'm about to be the lord of my own little village. A village that has apparently claimed the lives of both my father and my grandfather in the same line of work that I am expected to pursue once I get there. On top of that, there is something there that may have taken a liking to my taste and may decide to try me out in real life this time, promise or no promise. We thought the horrors were over, but another twisted chapter awaited us. Does sleep paralysis normally get worse? Tune 2 for part 1, watch our previous video, and subscribe to our channel for more stories. It's been a week since my last post, and a lot has happened, and I still can't tell if it's all in my head, so I would really like some advice. Can all of this be explained by a mixture of a murder plot and my severe form of sleep paralysis? Or am I being hunted by a monster? The first night after the incident, I tried to sleep in the house. It all happened. It took me hours to finally sleep, and when I did, I had horrendous nightmares. Seeing Pauline in such a contorted state, her guts spewing up through the drainage hole, her arm skin peeled as it nearly got sucked into the pipe, exposing the muscle and tendons twisting and snapped. I couldn't shake the image. I dreamt of myself slowly being sucked into the drain as I showered. I could imagine the pain of my legs breaking to fit down such a narrow gap. Every time I would have a nightmare, I would wake up just as I died. And whenever I would wake up, I would be stuck, unmoving, trapped in my paralyzed body. All the usual symptoms were there. The visions, blurry blobs, and the voices speaking to me about chaotic nonsense. The speakers tried to talk, but you couldn't convince them. It was awful. The entire time I waited for the beast to return, for it to murmur my name into my unreactive skull. I would pray it wouldn't wait until I finally broke free and snatch me and haul me down the drain. It was hell. In the morning, I was awoken to a banging on my front door, a slamming of tremendous force that sent my heart crashing through my chest. I immediately thought it was that hellish creature again, rummaging through my house in search of prey, but of course it wasn't. It wasn't real, I thought to myself. It couldn't be. The police had given me a reasonable excuse, an insane story that explained an insane crime. The bashing at the door continued, so I wreathed myself from bed and ran to the front. Peeling open the door, I saw an officer, one of the many that questioned me the day prior. His partner stood behind him, rudely leaning against the hood of my car, staining the blue paint with his mangy fingerprints. "Morning, son," he said, his face filled with upset. "What in the hell are you still doing here?" I looked past him at Pauline's house. The place was crawling with officers, some in hazmat suits, detectives, and even a few men in black suits and sunglasses. The entire force was out for this case. "Sorry, I thought I was allowed to stay here," I replied, still half asleep. "Of course you can, but after what you saw, especially with this criminal stuff going on, you're not safe. Head back home to your parents." The officer replied, his partner nodding in the back solemnly. I gave him a weak smile, and it broke immediately. I will. I glanced back at the house and then down the street. I hadn't noticed until now. The other houses clearly weren't occupied. No cars in driveways, no nosy neighbors, all the curtains shut. Pauline really did just rent these houses to murder the tenants. But why? I asked myself, and then I came to a conclusion. A lot of commenters on my last post did. Sacrifice to that thing. That monster that came into my room, Pauline had been appeasing it, and she failed when I had managed to narrowly escape its grasp by being unable to stir awake. I looked back to the cop, his face still a concerned frown. "Sir, no one believed me yesterday, but I think you're following the wrong lead." I spouted frantically, his partner perking up and walking over to me as I spoke. He nodded for me to continue. "The night Pauline died, the day before I found her, I was attacked in my room. A monster attacked me, it held me, and it tried to eat me the same way it ate." The officer raised his hand right in my face. I could smell the sweat on his palm. "Let's contextualize this, please. Maybe someone did attack you that night. Maybe some drugged-up loony broke into your room, or one of the killers, but not a monster." I flung my head back in disbelief. Why the hell would I make something like this up? He raised his palm again. "Calm down, Bailey. Listen. Describe the monster to me, and Henry will draw a sketch in his notebook. He used to be a sketch artist for assault victims." Henry nodded and pulled out his little book from his front pocket. "Henry will draw a humanized version of what you saw, and we'll see if we can add it to the investigation." I was annoyed, but I understood. My story was insane. Even I thought so. The officer maybe had a good idea. I hallucinate when I get sleep paralysis. Maybe when a real person is within my vision, my brain distorts their features. It had never happened before, and it was a decent explanation. I described the monster, chainsaw teeth and all, and Henry drew an admittedly hilarious depiction of a human with a confusingly long nose and bucked teeth. I nearly laughed, but the serious looks of both officers yanked me back to reality. After the encounter, I felt more at peace. There's no such thing as monsters, just horrible people. Over the course of the day, I packed my most important things and called my parents. They obviously let me back home, but told me my room had already been converted into storage space, so I would be sleeping on the couch. It wasn't too bad, and I was away from Pauline's corpse and her house. The next few days were fine. The sleep paralysis went back to being a nuisance rather than a waking nightmare, and I was slowly getting the visual of a bloomed, gored body out of my head. Then I had a fight with my mom. I should have stayed. The fight wasn't even that bad, just about how messy I can be. She lost her shit, and so did I, and in an act of pure stupidity, I drove back to that house in the dead of night. I regret my decision so much. I could have called a friend or just put up with it for a few more hours, but instead, I freaked out and drove back. It was around 10 when I went back. Rage fueled me to autopilot all the way back to the house. I was so infuriated with her tiny jabs that I had forgotten the horrors I experienced until I pulled into my driveway. Pauline's house had been roped off, and the door was covered in yellow hazard tape. No more cops were there, but all the lights remained on. I'm guessing as a deterrent for would-be thieves stealing from a dead woman. I didn't even turn off the car. I remembered the vile things that happened, and I went to put it in reverse, and then my phone pinged. My mom. "You couldn't have cleaned your filth before you left?" The text read. I was so mad. She couldn't have just said something kind, something about how dumb it was to move back in only 4 days after I had a near-death experience. I cranked the handbrake up, grabbed my bag, and went inside. The house smelt putrid. There was a mixture of smells, the usual awfulness of the pipes mixed with some food I moronically had left on the counter rotting. It looked like strips of bacon that I assumed I was defrosting the night before I abandoned ship. I brought my stuff to my room, only flicking on my room light, using my phone's flash to navigate the rest of the way. The smell was revolting. I felt so stupid. How did I forget about an entire slab of bacon? I didn't even have bacon most mornings. Hell, I rarely have breakfast. "Bailey?" The voice echoed through the house and punched me like a shotgun. I felt cold, my stomach heaved, and tears immediately welled in my eyes. The gap in the speech, the deepness, it was in my house with me. It was here. I was looking for me. I rotated where I stood, unpacking some clothes, and looked towards the door to the pitch-black hallway. I couldn't see it, not yet. "Have you come back?" I then heard the wet slapping on the tile floor of my house. It was far away, at the opposite end of my house, maybe in the kitchen. Hopefully in the bathroom, because if it's in the kitchen, I walked right past it when I came in. It was moving slow, each step a second apart. I needed to get help and fast. I dialed 000 and slammed the phone to my ear. "You have dialed emergency 000, the phone said. When the woman answered and asked what the emergency was, I froze. I couldn't speak. It would hear me. It would find me. "Excuse me, is anyone there?" "There's something in the house with me," I whispered, turning the phone volume to 0 and sliding it into my pocket. They can track phones, right? The slapping continued. It was getting close, but the noise was still distant. I scanned my room. I needed a place to hide. I locked eyes with my reflection in the window. I should just run away, I thought. I bolted to the window and slid it open. The noise of the old window was deafening. It took such force to crack, and the rusted bearings kept rattling and banging the glass pane as I scraped it open. "Bailey." The voice bellowed, and the footfalls became quicker, a normal pace now. I looked at the fly screen and tried to yank it off, but it didn't budge. The child safety feature caused it to be physically attached to the frame. The banging and crashing of me squirming to rip the damn thing off was so loud, and the footfalls grew fast. It was running through my house. I heard it slam into the table in the dining room. Its weight caused it to grind across the wooden floor, and I heard it smash into the wall. "Bailey!" it screamed. It was so close, a hallway away, and I was dead. I was fucked. I gave the fly screen one last shoulder charge and barely split the plastic. I needed to hide now. There was no other way. I dove to the floor and scrambled under the bed. As it entered the room, my feet had just slipped under the dangling sheet. It may have seen me. I was petrified. I may not have been quick enough. I held back vomiting and my head spun in fear. I saw its gigantic feet and strangely thin legs enter my room. I heard the grinding and splitting of its gums as it began to rotate its teeth, the drool splashing against the carpet, soaking into it, just in front of my face. Splotches of its own blood mixed in with the frothy spittle in front of my face. The creature began to explore my room. It pushed hard on my cupboard door, splitting the wood as it leaned inside. I could see its back. Its spine stuck out and looked close to bursting through its skin. Small holes lined its back, leaking a fatty, pus-filled ooze that drained down to its legs. It had thin, long wires of hair that draped from the back of its head and down past its shoulders. It turned away from the cupboard, and I saw its face, the upturned nose and gigantic, protruding horse-like maw and bulbous eyes that rolled around independently to each other. The teeth rotated in its skull and were now drenched in blood. Each tooth looked like a molar until the occasional canine showed up. I crawled deeper backwards. If I could see its eyes, it could see mine. It meandered past the bed and to the window. I heard it lean against the fly screen as it looked outside, the wire snapping under the weight. "You are Hura," it said. The echoing sound of its voice remained even while it stood in the same room as me. "Bailey, where are you?" Its voice sounded monotone but angry. It had a growl to it. It wanted me. It wanted to eat me. I lowered my head and looked toward the hallway. It was a straight shot out. I just had to run when it was back at the cupboard. I then felt it lean on the bed. The entire bed buckled. The weight of this thing, the wood creaked and groaned as it splintered slightly. I heard a splash of liquid and felt it spray my legs. I turned my head to see what it was doing. It was leaning down, and the drool it had contained within its mouth had dumped out onto the floor. It was trying to look under the bed. I slowly watched in horror as one of its eyes came into view. I hauled myself as quick as I could from under the bed. It screamed an awful animal screech as the teeth whirred so much faster. I got out from the bed and saw it in full view, its head so close to touching the ceiling as it stood tall. I scrambled as quickly as I could backwards as it launched itself over the bed. Its arms extended outwards, gigantic hands grasping out as it barreled down on me. I squished myself into a ball and it just missed me, flying past and crashing into the cupboard. I jumped to my feet and ran for the door. My shoulder whacked into the doorframe on the way out, sending a wave of pain through my body. But I didn't slow down. I couldn't slow down. This thing was fast. I could hear it gaining on me. I circled around the corner and started heading towards the front door. Not the quickest way out, but I had less of a chance of being cornered if things went south. The wet slapping of the creature's feet behind me grew closer, the grinding and sloshing of the teeth so loud as if it was just behind my head. I then felt it hit my back, a firm strike from my right shoulder that then scratched down to my mid-back. It must have missed me with its full palm and just nicked me with its gnarled finger. How had it got so close? There was no way I would have made it to the front door, so I turned into the kitchen. It had 2 exits, and I couldn't be trapped. As I turned in, the rancid smell of the bacon sent my head spinning and my eyes began to water. I heard the beast miss the turn and crash loudly into another wall and let out a bellowing screech that sounded more echoed, like a lost coal miner screaming for help in a cave. I looked for any potential hiding spots in the kitchen, my eyes vaguely adjusting to the darkness. I finally got a better look at the bacon on the counter and nearly vomited. The strips of flesh were pale, white, and were fatter than most bacon. A singled vet was found in one of the strips, and on the other, a nipple. It wasn't bacon, it was strips of human flesh, torn apart in thin peels, left to rot on my counter. How long had the monster been living in my house? Where else had this thing stored food? I didn't know and didn't have time to search. In my morbid curiosity, I had slowed, and I saw the thing's head round into the kitchen. Its right eye staring at me, its teeth spinning, its face more horse in shape from a side profile. Its massive hand, wide enough to engulf my torso, wrapped its horrid fingers around the corner to the room as it entered, stalking like a raptor in search of prey. Without moving its mouth, it spoke. "Bailey, Why did you leave? It had slowed now to a walking pace. I stopped and stared in horror. I was so scared that my legs locked up and I couldn't move. I was begging myself to move, praying that I would shift even an inch, but just as if I was in sleep paralysis, I was stuck in my own body. I have grown so hungry, it continued, the teeth slowing to a near halt. It had fully entered the kitchen now. Feed me? It requested, its voice almost pleading. I was shocked. This thing just a moment prior had chased me through the house. It swiped at my shoulder, and then it stopped to talk, to beg. My mind raced. The quickest way out was the front door, but if it guarded that side of the kitchen, it would catch me if I ran. It had stopped completely, its massive size towering over me, but I was safe. I decided to stay still, or maybe I was still paralyzed with fear. Was this what Pauline went through? Did she get approached and forced to sacrifice the locals to this beast in exchange for her life? Would I cower so low? Bailey! It screamed at me, shocking my senses and restarting my panic. It had rage in its alien eyes, viscous, horrifying rage. It needed an answer or I was dead. I placed my hand on the counter, slowly navigating it across until I found the edge of a knife. One of its eyes watched my hand while the other stared angrily into my eyes. My jaw hung open, not knowing how to respond. Bailey. Once again, the voice shook my chest like a shockwave, and my stomach sank as it began inching closer, its chainsaw whirring up again. In one quick motion, I whipped the knife at it and ran. The blade clanked between its teeth and then fell down its gullet. As I turned to run, I heard the thing start to choke. It let out a wretched gag and tremendous scream. I rounded the corner and spotted the front door. Red and blue lights illuminated the cracks to the outside world. My saviors had just arrived. I took flight and ran as hard as I could towards the front door, and my moment of happiness was cut short as the monster stepped in front of me. Having predicted my escape, I crashed into it and slipped, my head slamming into the ground, the entire weight of my body on my neck. The pain hit me so violently. The warmth of blood filled my back as my cracked skull spewed crimson across the floor. I started seeing stars and my consciousness faded. I saw the thing loom over me, the knife blade jutting through where a throat would normally be on any other creature. Blood leaked across its chest. It reached down and grabbed my leg. It started to drag me away. I could feel the skin on my head opening more as it was pulled across the wooden floor. As my vision faded, I knew I was dead. I would never wake up again. I heard the police banging on the door and calling something that my dizzied mind couldn't comprehend. I then saw the creature turn and look at me one final time and say something that sent a wave of memories through my mind. "Are you awake, Bailey?" I blacked out. When I awoke, I was on a stretcher being hauled into the back of an ambulance. Cops surrounded my house. At least 3 cars were out the front. I scanned each window I could see from the front yard, waiting to see a silhouette of the demon, but I saw nothing. When the paramedic saw me trying to move my head, she calmly placed her hand on me and told me to remain still and that it was all over. Remaining perfectly still was apparently what I was good at, so I just laid there, staring at the midnight sky. That night in the hospital, I didn't sleep. Even the drugs they gave me didn't shake the restlessness the night's events had caused. How close that thing got to me, the strips of human flesh it was leaving to rot. I got so close to dying, so close to having my body hauled down the pipes by a creature too massive to even remotely think about fitting. I couldn't sleep because I knew my first bout of sleep paralysis would make me insane, drive me over the edge. I needed medication or nighttime monitoring, something to stop this madness. Although sleep paralysis saved me once before, maybe the pros outweigh the cons. In the morning, the police arrived. They made me answer insane questions and refused to believe that it was a monster that attacked me. I didn't back down this time. I repeated to them that they were looking for a demon, alien, or mutant, and not some poorly planned murder syndicate. They didn't trust a word that came from my mouth. Their explanation was psychosis. The panic of being back in the house made me hallucinate the attacker as some monster. The emergency operator claimed she heard yelling, someone yelling Bailey over and over, but the muffling of my pants pocket made it insanely hard to understand. She claimed there was no echo on her end. and that the voice sounded like an aggressive man but not inhuman. When I asked about the strips of flesh, the officers said they found them and assumed it was body parts of the previous victims. In my bathroom, there was apparently a stack of degloved body parts, faces, hands, and entire limbs. I asked about my missing knife, and they said I must have landed a good shot on the attacker, sticking it in him, or at least in his clothes. I asked about the pile of blood and drool in my room. They couldn't tell at first glance if the liquid was drool, but the blood was most likely mine from my back wound. I got furious and attempted to explain that I wasn't slashed across the back until way later, and they tossed that aside as confusion from the trauma. No matter what I threw at them, they had a reasonable explanation, some crazy way to toss aside that I was attacked by a beast. They just assumed a gigantic over 6 feet behemoth of a man was squatting in my house, hiding from the police while they searched Pauline's residence, and I startled him. He didn't kill me since the cops had arrived and fled out the back door, leaving his evidence behind. To be honest, I'm starting to believe them. What happened to me can't be real. It can't be. I'm coming to Reddit this final time to ask more definitively. Can sleep paralysis cause psychosis? Can it drive someone mad to the point of hallucination? Am I safe at my parents' house? I'm not returning to that house to collect my stuff alone, and when I do go back, I will never stay the night again. If that creature was real, I intend to starve it out. Just when we thought we knew fear, a darker story emerged from the shadows. Tales at Law, the Last Will and Testament series. I am still a lawyer. For now. My disbarment hearing was postponed for another 2 weeks. Something about a last-minute witness, unlikely to be good for me. Not that it matters. I'm not exactly in the headspace to be practicing law at the moment, so being barred for 2 more weeks is neither here nor there. While I have the time, I figured I'd share another story to take my mind off my impending disbarment. This one takes place after I left the public defender's office. I had recently joined an almost full-service private law firm. They handled everything except for family law and criminal law. I wasn't sure what practice area I wanted to join, they just liked that I had trial experience. Funnily enough, I ended up handling very little trial work during my tenure, but that's beside the point. My first year or so there was spent in their estate planning unit. I won't bore you with legal jargon and will explain it as necessary, but I'll split it up into 2 parts. There's 1, the planning side, and 2, the administration side. We handled both. As you can imagine, the planning side involved a lot of paperwork, hours dedicated to pushing paper and writing lengthy legal clauses. The administration side, on the other hand, was drama central. I remember when my managing partner popped into my office and dropped the subject case file onto my desk. She didn't knock. It's rare that someone does in an active legal office, and unless we were on a client call, the door had to be open. Something about making sure we were available. It was a thick manila folder, no client name on the label, stuffed with papers. And yes, I understand in the 21st century that everything is online, and we did have an electronic case managing system. Old habits die hard, and this particular partner loved printing things out. So I got the paper file, inclusive of every thought, email, memo, or otherwise about the estate. You remember the estate? She asked nonchalantly, without a glance up from the phone in her hand, no doubt putting out another fire. Read, checking email, texting your spouse, scrolling social media, etc. Anything that wasn't actual work. Whose estate? Well, he died. Son's asking for us to administer it. I repeated, whose estate? Client agreement signed. Bill under the Kellerman matter. Should be in the system and use the timer, please. We bill every 6 minutes for our time. Less than 6, round up. I had a bad habit of not using the timer and letting minutes slip through the cracks here and there. It's tedious. Okay, this is a no judgment zone, if anything. Be happy that I never overcharged a client. Even if it only resulted from forgetting to do so, I'll break down the client file for you. Dead Kellerman had a will. In theory, that allows someone to divide their property in whatever way they want. This can make some people angry, for obvious reasons. In short, my job was to read the will, collect all the stuff, notify all relevant parties, and distribute it. This will was a doozy. 3 ex-wives, 8 kids split between them, 3 more stepkids, too many grandchildren to list, and one illegitimate child. I stared at the open manila folder, feeling a sense of dread settle in my stomach. Outside of my overwhelming caseload, the complexity of the Kellerman estate was daunting. I flipped through the pages, noting the numerous names and the tangled web of relationships. Each connection held a potential grudge, a whispered resentment, or a long-buried secret that I desperately did not wish to know. Over the next few weeks, as I delved deeper into the intricacies of the Kellerman estate, a nagging sensation that I was missing something crept over me. I began receiving strange phone calls from the various members of the Kellerman family. My phone would ring once, but when I went to answer, I was greeted by nothing but silence. At first, I brushed it off. I've dealt with my fair share of clients, and I understood that most people's first interactions with lawyers is on the worst day of their lives, so trepidation is expected. But the calls started escalating, becoming more frequent, targeting me at home at all hours of the day and night. Then the letters started, again from seemingly every member of the family, each letter containing blank pages of paper. I thought it was some sort of cruel prank, an odd family ritual or a manifestation of grief. Trust me, I've seen weirder. But the silence was unnerving. Each time I opened a fresh envelope, the blank pages seemed to taunt me, their emptiness a haunting echo ever present in my mind. One night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I began digging deeper in the Kellerman files, scouring every document, every email, and any hint of the family's history that might offer some explanation for this strange behavior. As I pored over the estate planning documents, I noticed something odd about the will. In the section detailing distribution of assets, there were handwritten notes in the margin, scribbled words that felt like whispers from beyond the grave. They were almost illegible, but I could make out a few words, here and there. Betrayal, revenge, never forget. Suddenly my phone rang, causing me to jump. I checked the time, 1:05 a.m. I rubbed my bloodshot eyes, wondering who could be calling at this hour. I picked it up, cautiously, half expecting silence, but this time a voice crackled through the line, a raspy, disembodied voice that sent chills down my spine. "Stop looking. You can't afford to know." I dropped the phone, paralyzed with fear. My heart raced, and my instincts told me to abandon this case, to let some other unfortunate associate take it on. But I was in too deep. The thought of losing my position, my reputation, haunted me more than the calls or the letters. The next morning, I returned to my office with a sense of dread. My managing partner greeted me with a strange, knowing smile that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Figure it out yet?" she asked, voice low, a hushed whisper, almost conspiratorial. "Figure what out?" I stammered. She stepped closer, her breath reeking of coffee and cigarette tar. "The reason for the letters, the calls, the family. Oh, they're dying to get to know you, to let you in, to share their secrets, but they're afraid. So very afraid of what might happen if the truth were to, let's say, get out." I stepped back, confused. "What truth?" She smiled, but instead of answering, Simple turned and walked away, heels clicking on the tiles of our polished office floor. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I abruptly left work, heading home to conduct more research without the watchful eye of my managing partner. I spent the evening researching the Kellermans, diving into local newspapers, public records, and any other source I could get my hands on. It was a twisted tale. Murders, disappearances, allegations of abuse. As I pieced together their history, I came to the realization that the estate wasn't just about money or property. It was a minefield of long-buried grudges, and the Kellermans had buried more than just their dead. That night, staring blankly at article after article, surrounded by the weight of the Kellerman files, I felt like Sisyphus. As I poured myself another cup of coffee from my third pot of the day, my computer screen flickered and went dark. I cursed under my breath and got up to check the breaker. A cold draft brushed past me, causing me to stop in my tracks, despite the still air of my apartment. And then my phone rang. I picked up, not even eking out a yellow, before a voice so raspy it was as if I was being spoken to by a fork in a blender, whispered, "You're in over your head, lawyer." And the line went dead. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I felt like I was being hunted. The next day, I summoned the courage to confront the surviving family members, one by one. Each encounter sent me sprawling deeper into their madness. eyes flickered with fear. Anger simmered just beneath the surface, and each family member mirrored the other's paranoia. They all spoke in hushed tones, as if someone was listening, as if the walls themselves had ears. By the end of the week, I could no longer eat. I could no longer sleep. I was a ghost of myself, consumed by the need to understand. The calls grew more frequent, the letters felt heavier, more menacing, each one taunting me with the emptiness of their pages, the secrets they threatened to spill. I was drawn into a darkness I couldn't shake off, despite my rational mind screaming for me to walk away. On the day of the asset distribution, the family gathered in the conference room of my office. It was the first time I had stepped foot back in the office since the last encounter with my managing partner. The tension was palpable. Faces glared across the polished conference table, each relative a simmering pot of resentment, of hate. I had prepared to confront them as a whole, to lay bare the pieces I had picked up from each of them, to unravel the tangled web of their lives, and to bring some clarity to the chaos that was the Kellerman family. As I began outlining the distribution of assets, the atmosphere shifted. A woman, Kellerman's second wife, stood up, hands trembling, and stuttered out, "Ye, you have no idea what you're dealing with." Her voice rose. "Ye, you're playing with fire. Ye, young man? Everyone has a claim," I replied, trying to keep my tone even. "Let's keep this civil." But it wasn't. It never was. As I went through each provision of dead Kellerman's will, tempers flared. Accusations flew like daggers. Suddenly, a man at the back of the room, Kellerman's youngest son, slammed his fists on the table, knocking over a few files, and addressed me. "You're just a pawn in this game, boy. You think you can fix us? You have no idea what this family has done to survive, what is asked, nay, demanded of us." I recoiled at his intensity. His eyes burned with rage, a raw, desperate anger. I glanced around the room, realizing the other family members wore similar expressions, each grappling with their own hidden burdens. I pressed on, determined to regain control of the meeting, but I was too late. As I attempted to continue through the terms of the will, voices rose to a cacophony. I was no longer guiding the conversation. I was in the center of a tempest. "Enough!" I shouted, the words escaping my lips like a dog through an open door before I could regain my composure. My temples throbbed as a migraine began to take hold. The room fell silent, but I swear you could hear each beat of my heart. "Enough," I repeated, more calmly this time, trying to cut through the tension. "We're here to settle this, to honor the late Kellerman's wishes." My words hung heavy in the air, seeming only to stoke the tempers of the Kellermans. Maybe that's the problem. The illegitimate child, Kellerman's last secret, spoke up quietly, voice high, yet hardly a whisper, a stark comparison to the rest of the family. He never wanted any of us to know about each other. The room erupted again, each voice echoing like the drum beats of a battle. But this time, they weren't just fighting each other. They were fighting their guilt and complicity. As the chaos continued to unfold, I realized I was no longer just an attorney, but a witness to a family unraveling at the seams. Their secrets suffocated them, binding them in a vicious cycle of anger and denial. I felt a wave of pity wash over me for each of them, trapped in a web they couldn't escape. Then, the son who had slammed the table stood up again, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We don't need your help. You think you can solve this with paperwork? You're just going to make it worse." At that moment, I knew he was right. The more I pushed, the more I would unravel the already frayed threads. Perhaps the only way to bring closure wasn't through legalities, but through understanding, through stepping back and allowing them to face their own demons. A thought flickered across my mind. I could walk away, hand in the files, and let them hash it out among themselves. Maybe they needed to confront their history without me mediating their pain. As I gathered my things to leave, the youngest son stood once more. Every eye snapped to me. His lips curled upwards in a snarl. In a voice that I recognized as the one that had been torturing me over the phone, he spat, "You think you can escape this? You think you can just walk away?" I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the past week lift just a little. "It's not me that you should be worried about. It's each other you need to face. We're done here." Anger flickered across his face for a brief moment, but he didn't reply, and I thought, for a split second, a sense of understanding registered with him. I turned and walked out of the conference room, feeling free in a way I hadn't for months. Looking back on it, I wish that I had heeded the young Kellerman's warning, for worse was yet to come. That was only the first tale. What came after still haunts me to this day. The forgotten ritual. In a small, isolated town nestled deep in the woods, there was an old tradition that had been passed down through generations, though few remembered its true purpose. Every year, on the first night of autumn, the townspeople gathered in the square, lit a single lantern, and carried it to the edge of the forest. The ritual had become more of a quaint ceremony than anything else. A simple tradition with no real meaning, or so they thought. For as long as anyone could remember, no one had dared ask why the ritual was performed. But this year, something was different. The air felt heavier, the sky darker than usual. Clara, a teenager curious by nature, decided to follow the group that led the procession. She wanted to know what they did after lighting the lantern and leaving it at the edge of the woods. She watched from the shadows as the lantern was placed carefully on the ground, its flickering flame casting strange shadows on the twisted trees. Once the villagers left, Clara snuck closer, feeling the pull of the woods like never before. She had always felt uneasy about the forest. Its dense, gnarled trees seemed alive, their branches reaching out like fingers ready to grab anyone who ventured too far. But tonight, the feeling was worse, like the forest was watching her. She stood in front of the lantern, staring into the darkness beyond. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a sound that chilled her to the bone, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from deep within the forest. Suddenly, the flame of the lantern flickered and died. Silence fell over the woods, heavier than before. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing second. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen with fear. She turned to run, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as if the ground beneath her had shifted, locking her in place. The footsteps stopped, and a voice, ancient and gravely, called out from the darkness. "You forgot the offering." Clara's blood ran cold. She had no idea what the voice meant, but every instinct screamed at her to run. Finally breaking free of the invisible grip, she turned and bolted back toward town, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible. The wind howled behind her, and she could feel something, someone, following. When she burst into the town square, gasping for breath, no one was there. The houses were dark, the streets empty. Confused, she knocked on doors, shouted for help, but the town was deserted. It was as if everyone had vanished. That's when she saw it. In the middle of the square, a figure stood, draped in shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, bony limbs that twisted in unnatural angles. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but Clara could feel its gaze piercing through her. The voice spoke again, clearer now, as the figure stepped closer. "You forgot the offering," it repeated, each word slow and deliberate. Clara backed away, her eyes darting around for any sign of life. But she was alone. Alone with whatever this thing was. The figure extended a skeletal hand toward her, and Clara felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. The cobblestones of the square began to crack, and from the earth, twisted roots emerged, coiling around her ankles and dragging her toward the figure. Panicking, she tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body was bound, the roots tightening around her legs, waist, and chest, pulling her closer to the shadowy figure. "Long ago they knew," the voice hissed. "They offered freely to keep me at bay. But they've forgotten, and now you must pay the price." Clara's vision blurred as the roots squeezed tighter, and the last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the figure's hood lifting, revealing hollow, glowing eyes staring hungrily into her soul. The next morning, the townspeople awoke to find the lantern still unlit at the edge of the forest. Clara nowhere to be found. Only an eerie silence lingered in the air, and a sense of dread washed over the town. No one spoke of what had happened, but the next autumn, the lantern was lit once again, and this time, an offering was made. No one ever forgot the ritual again. The screams from one story faded, only to be replaced by whispers of something even more chilling. Midnight taxi fare. I've been driving a taxi in this soulless city for over 5 years now. It's a big city, sure, but that doesn't make it alive. It's like one of those old, hollow shells you find washed up on the beach. all grandeur on the outside but empty inside. The streets are vast and lined with looming buildings, yet they feel vacant, like a stage set up for some play that never took place. I've spent countless nights winding through its dark avenues, its forgotten back streets, and its dismal corners. Some say you get used to the darkness. I'm not so sure. Working the night shift has become a routine, the kind that grinds away at your soul slowly, like sandpaper on wood. I've grown accustomed to the strange passengers, the fleeting conversations that vanish into the void as soon as they're over. My cab becomes their confessional booth. I'm their silent priest, hearing secrets, lies, laughter, and fear. But tonight, something felt different. The air carried a certain weight, an eerie chill that seeped through the car windows as I cruised through the empty streets. It was around 11 p.m., and I was waiting for my first fare of the night. I always start my shifts with a quick stop at my usual coffee stand, a little joint tucked away on the corner of Elm Street. It's become a sort of ritual, a cup of black coffee to kickstart the night. I sipped it slowly, letting the warmth fill me up as I watched the fog begin to drift in, curling around the streetlights and swallowing the outlines of distant buildings. Finally, my phone beeped, the notification for a new fare lighting up the screen. I squinted at the address, some office building about a 10-minute drive away. Here we go, I muttered, tossing the empty cup into the trash before getting into the driver's seat. As I navigated through the city streets, I couldn't shake off the strange feeling that tonight was going to be different. The fog grew denser as I drove, blurring the edges of everything around me, creating a world where shapes and shadows mingled. When I arrived at the pickup point, a middle-aged man stood on the curb, impeccably dressed in a crisp suit and tie. He looked out of place here, like he belonged to a different era, a different city. I glanced at him through the passenger window, noting the sharpness of his attire. "Evening," I greeted him as he climbed into the back seat. He didn't respond immediately, just nodded slightly and settled in. His silence was unnerving, but I've had my share of quiet fares, so I didn't think much of it. "Where to?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Archer Street, the old part of town," he said, his voice smooth yet hollow, like an echo in an empty hallway. I raised an eyebrow. That part of the city was practically deserted, especially this late at night. But it wasn't my business to ask questions. "All right," I replied, putting the car into drive and pulling away from the curb. The fog seemed to thicken as we moved through the streets, the city lights dimming until they were nothing more than a soft, hazy glow. We drove in silence for a while. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to focus on the drive and ignore the increasingly oppressive atmosphere. Every now and then, I'd steal a glance in the rearview mirror, checking on the passenger. He sat there, unnervingly still, staring out the window with his face half hidden in the shadows. We reached a red light. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for it to change. It was then that I glanced into the rearview mirror again, and my heart skipped a beat. The man was smiling, but not just any smile. It was an unnatural, grotesque stretch of the lips that spread wider and wider until it looked like his face might split in two. I snapped my head around to look directly at him, my mouth opening to say something, but the words died on my tongue. The smile was gone. He sat there, expressionless, his gaze still fixed on the window. "Are you all right?" he asked suddenly, his voice calm and mocking. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I swallowed, forcing a laugh that came out strained. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a bit tired," I replied, turning back to face the road. I could feel my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the wheel tighter. I hit the gas as soon as the light turned green, my eyes darting nervously to the mirror every few seconds. But the man's face remained blank, emotionless, as though nothing strange had happened. We arrived at his destination, a quiet, dimly lit street in the old part of town. I slowed the car to a stop, taking in the sight of rundown buildings and shuttered windows. The place had an abandoned, forgotten feel to it. Why would a man like him want to be here? "Take care now," he said softly, almost mockingly, as he opened the door and stepped out. He paused for a moment, looking back at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Then he walked off into the darkness. I sat there for a moment, staring at his retreating figure until it disappeared into the fog. My hands felt clammy against the steering wheel. I've seen my share of odd passengers, but something about this one left a mark, like an ink blot on the back of my mind that wouldn't fade. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease. Just another passenger, I muttered to myself, putting the car in drive. Just as I was about to leave, my phone buzzed, signaling another fare request. I glanced at the screen. It was close by. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts telling me to leave this part of the city. But business was business, and there weren't many drivers around here, especially at this hour. I accepted the fare and began driving toward the pickup location. The fog was thicker now, swirling around the car like a living thing, its tendrils stretching out and wrapping around the lampposts. As I approached the pickup area, I spotted a figure standing beneath a dim streetlight. Their outline was barely visible in the mist. I slowed the car to a stop beside the person, but something felt off. I couldn't make out their face or any features for that matter. It was as if the darkness around them swallowed the details. The person stood there for a moment before turning and walking away into an alley, never once acknowledging the taxi. "What the?" I muttered, my eyes squinting to follow the figure. Maybe it wasn't the client? I glanced around, searching for any sign of another passenger, but the street was empty. There was no one else in sight. I checked my phone again. The app showed I was in the correct location, but no one had approached. I waited for a few more minutes, glancing nervously at the alleyway where the figure had disappeared. Still nothing. A strange feeling gnawed at my stomach, telling me to leave. "Forget this," I muttered under my breath, pulling away from the curb. The fog swallowed the headlights as I navigated back onto the main road, my heart thumping louder than before. As I drove, a flicker of movement caught my eye. There, at the end of the street, stood a figure, silent, still, staring at my car. I opened the window, calling out, "Did you order a taxi?" No response. The figure turned slowly and walked away, just like before. "All right, this is getting weird," I muttered, an edge of fear creeping into my voice. I hit the gas, not wanting to stick around to see if this shadow would appear again. I glanced at the rearview mirror as I passed through the intersection, half expecting to see the figure one more time. And there it was, or what looked like the same person. Same posture, standing motionless as I sped away. I didn't stop this time. I just wanted to get out of this area and into the more familiar parts of the city. A few minutes later, I found myself in a somewhat livelier part of town. The fog had thinned out, the streetlights casting a more comforting glow. I pulled over next to a small coffee stand, needing something to settle my nerves. The warmth of the coffee seeped into my hands, grounding me for a moment. I sipped it, standing by my car, trying to rationalize what had just happened. It had to be the fog playing tricks on me. That, combined with the shadows and the late hour, it was messing with my mind. "Get a grip," I muttered, finishing the last of the coffee and tossing the cup into a nearby trash can. I needed another fare, something to take my mind off these unsettling encounters. I got back into the car, checked my phone, and accepted the next request. This time it was fairly close by. Maybe a normal passenger would ease my nerves. I drove through the slightly more illuminated streets toward the new pickup location. The city's vibe was different here, but that sense of unease clung to me like a thick fog. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that same figure standing motionless behind me. But nothing appeared. The pickup spot was just a few blocks away, a small intersection where the road dipped into a tunnel. I arrived and idled at the curb, looking around for any sign of my fare. After a few moments, a man emerged from the shadows of the tunnel. He walked calmly toward the taxi, his figure gradually coming into focus under the streetlights. My muscles tensed as he approached, but I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw his face. He looked relatively normal, probably in his mid-30s, wearing an old jacket and carrying a bag slung over his shoulder. He opened the rear door and got in, nodding as a greeting. "Thanks for stopping. I need to get to the old house on the outskirts of town," he said in a deep, monotone voice. "An old house?" My instincts flared up. "The outskirts?" I repeated, turning to look at him. "You sure you want to go there? It's pretty deserted at this hour." "Yeah," he replied, his eyes locked onto mine in the rearview mirror. There was an intensity in his gaze that sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm sure. It's where I need to go." I nodded, trying to suppress the unease bubbling up inside me. All right then, I muttered and put the car into gear. We drove off, leaving the more populated part of the city behind. The road stretched out in front of us, long and winding. Streetlights grew sparse, replaced by shadows cast by the twisted branches of old trees lining the road. The city slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror, and a deep sense of isolation set in. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to glance back at the passenger, who remained eerily quiet. Minutes passed, and an oppressive silence filled the car. I turned on the radio, hoping to drown out the quiet with some white noise. Static crackled through the speakers, a harsh reminder of how far from civilization we had driven. I switched it off, regretting the decision almost immediately. The silence returned, now heavier, pressing in on all sides. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a faint glow coming from the direction of my passenger. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, his phone, the screen casting a dim light on his face. He wasn't looking at it, though. Instead, his eyes were fixed straight ahead, his face blank, almost expressionless. An involuntary shudder went through me. "So, what brings you out here this late?" I asked, trying to break the silence. My voice sounded strained, even to me. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, the movement slow and deliberate. "Business," he finally answered, his voice hollow, devoid of emotion. I nodded, focusing back on the road. A few more minutes passed in that unnerving quiet. Then, just as we approached a narrow, tree-lined lane leading deeper into the outskirts, the house came into view. It loomed in the darkness, an old, abandoned structure with a sagging roof and broken windows. But the strangest thing was the porch light. It flickered on and off, casting long, warped shadows across the ground. I knew this area well, and there was no electricity out here. The sight made my skin crawl. The car slowed as I pulled up in front of the house. My passenger stared at it, unblinking. "This is it," he said softly, finally breaking his silence. He got out of the car, but before closing the door, he turned back toward me. "Wait here," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I won't be long." I wanted to refuse, to drive away and leave him here with whatever madness this place held. But something in his eyes held me captive. I nodded reluctantly, and he shut the door, walking toward the house. I watched him disappear into the shadows on the porch. As I sat there, a strange sensation washed over me. It felt as if the darkness around the house was alive, pressing in on the car, squeezing the air out of my lungs. My hand instinctively reached for the radio, but I stopped myself. No static was going to make this feeling go away. Minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. My heart pounded louder with each passing second. The porch light flickered again, and I glanced toward the house, hoping to see my passenger returning. Instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A faint glow appeared in one of the upstairs windows, and then a silhouette. It was the passenger. He stood there, staring down at the car, his face obscured by the shadows. How did he get up there so fast? And why was he just staring? "All right, enough of this," I muttered to myself. I leaned out of the window and yelled, "Hey, come on, let's go!" My voice echoed in the stillness, but there was no response. He just continued to stare, unmoving. A part of me screamed to leave, but I couldn't just abandon him here in this god-forsaken place. I sighed, grabbing the flashlight from the glove compartment. "All right, just a quick check," I muttered, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine. I got out of the car, the door creaking loudly in the stillness of the night. The porch groaned under my weight as I stepped up to the entrance. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing a dark, musty hallway beyond. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and pushed the door open with a shaky hand. "Hello?" My voice echoed into the silence, disappearing into the dark corridors of the house. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I took a step forward. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of decay and neglect. As I moved cautiously through the hallway, the beam of my flashlight scanned the dust-covered surfaces. It caught the edge of a small round table in the corner. On it lay an old, yellowed newspaper. I stepped closer, the light illuminating the paper's front page. My heart skipped a beat. There, printed clearly, was the face of my passenger. His photo stared back at me, framed by the headline, "Local man found dead in abandoned house." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. What the? How was this possible? I had just driven this man here. He was alive, or at least I thought he was. A chill ran down my spine, making the hair on my arms stand up. I scanned the dimly lit room, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me with that unnerving stare. But there was no one, just darkness pressing in from all sides. I need to get out of here, I whispered to myself, feeling a surge of panic well up inside. I turned on my heel and ran toward the front door, not daring to look back. The floor creaked under my hurried steps, echoing through the emptiness of the house. I burst out onto the porch, gasping for breath, and made a beeline for the car. The moment I slammed the door shut and locked it, a slight wave of relief washed over me. I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out all other sounds. "Just get the hell out of here," I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. Then, out of nowhere, I sensed it, that familiar, eerie presence in the car. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I forced myself to look in the rearview mirror. And there he was. My passenger sat in the back seat, his form slumped and decayed, his eyes hollow and sunken. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his clothes appeared tattered. A feeling of nausea washed over me as I stared in horror at what had become of him. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. Then, slowly, his lips parted, and he whispered in a voice that sent shivers down my spine. "Take me home." I blinked, my body frozen with fear. Before I could react, his form began to dissolve, his body breaking apart into a thick, swirling cloud of black smoke. The smoke filled the car, enveloping me in its suffocating embrace. I coughed and fumbled for the door handle, nearly tearing it off in my panic as I stumbled out of the vehicle. The cold night air hit me like a shock as I fell to my knees, coughing and gasping. The fog outside seemed to grow thicker, pressing in from all directions. I glanced back at the car, half expecting to see the smoke spilling out, but there was nothing. Just the empty interior staring back at me. My pulse was racing, and I could barely think. I staggered back toward the porch of the house, seeking some sense of refuge. I collapsed onto the porch steps, my body trembling from the encounter. As I steadied my breathing, something caught my eye. There, lying on the wooden steps, was another newspaper. My stomach churned as I reached out with a shaky hand to pick it up. The front page stared back at me, and my heart sank into the pit of my stomach. This time, it wasn't the face of my passenger. It was mine. The headline read, "Local taxi driver disappears after strange incident." I dropped the newspaper, my hands going numb. My vision swam as a wave of terror washed over me. "No, this can't be happening," I muttered, shaking my head in disbelief. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it all. Was this some sort of twisted joke? A hallucination? I felt the world closing in around me, the fog growing thicker and darker, almost suffocating. The quietness of the surroundings became deafening, filled with an unspoken threat. I staggered to my feet, my heart pounding. "I have to leave," I muttered to myself. "I have to get out of here." I turned and stumbled down the porch steps, my legs feeling like lead. I glanced toward the car, but a part of me hesitated. The thought of going back inside, of sitting in that driver's seat again with who knows what possibly appearing in the back seat, filled me with dread. But as I took a step toward the car, I felt a shift in the air, a coldness brushing against the back of my neck. I turned around slowly, my pulse racing, expecting to see him standing there again. But there was nothing, just the dark, silent outline of the house against the foggy backdrop. My eyes darted to the newspaper on the porch, the image of my face glaring back at me in the dim light. A sense of inevitability washed over me, a feeling that no matter what I did, I couldn't outrun this. I forced myself to look away and made a break for the car, not caring about the consequences anymore. My only thought was to put as much distance between me and this nightmare as possible. My pulse roared in my ears as I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. The keys trembled in my grasp, but I managed to shove one into the ignition, twisting it with a sharp click. The engine sputtered to life, and I floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as the car lurched forward. Gravel spat out from under the wheels as I sped down the road, my eyes glued to the foggy path ahead. I could barely see through the mist, which seemed thicker now, like a living thing trying to swallow me whole. The house disappeared behind me, fading into the swirling fog as I drove. I didn't dare glance at the rearview mirror. The memory of what I had seen there earlier still burned in my mind. All I wanted was to make it back to the city, back to the safety of familiar streets and lights. The road stretched on, each second an eternity, as I focused on keeping the wheels steady. My mind replayed the events of the night in disjointed flashes, the strange man with the unnatural smile, the shifting fog, the passenger who shouldn't exist. None of it made sense, and I couldn't let my thoughts linger too long, or I'd spiral into panic. Minutes passed like hours, the fog slowly thinning out as I neared the city limits. The sight of distant streetlights, dim and hazy through the mist, brought a glimmer of hope. I wasn't free yet, but at least I was moving away from that house, that darkness. I eased my grip on the wheel as the city finally came into full view. The glow of the neon signs and streetlights felt almost comforting, even though the city was still eerily quiet. I pulled into an empty gas station parking lot, my hands shaking as I put the car in park. I leaned back, taking in deep breaths to steady myself. "It's over," I muttered, wiping sweat from my forehead. My heart was still hammering, but at least I was away from that place. I closed my eyes, trying to erase the image of that decaying face in the back seat. It had to be over. I was back in the city, surrounded by light and the faint hum of civilization. But even as I sat there, the cold sweat on my skin refused to fade. With a deep breath, I opened my eyes and looked at the rearview mirror. Nothing but an empty back seat stared back at me. I let out a sigh of relief, my heart rate finally starting to slow. I reached for my phone to call it a night, deciding I was done with this shift. Just as I unlocked the screen, a new notification popped up, a ride request. The pickup location made my stomach drop. It was the same isolated house I just fled from. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, the address glowing ominously. Without a second thought, I shut off the phone and tossed it onto the seat beside me. "That's it," I muttered, starting the engine. "I'm done." I drove off, vowing to never work as a taxi driver again. Some fares just weren't worth the cost. With one nightmare behind us, we were about to enter another, even worse. The house that knows your secrets. For years, I lived in a charming old house that my grandmother had left me. It was filled with antique furniture, faded photographs, and an unsettling sense of nostalgia. I loved it, despite the whispers of the neighbors who claimed it was cursed. They told stories about strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, shadows flitting by the windows at odd hours, and the air growing thick with tension at night. I brushed it off as local lore, believing that my grandmother's spirit was simply protecting her home. One evening, as I settled into bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air seemed heavier than usual, and shadows danced across the walls. I quickly fell asleep, only to awaken to the sensation of being watched. At first I attributed it to my imagination, but the feeling persisted, leaving me anxious and restless. The next day I found a dusty old journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the attic. It belonged to my grandmother and detailed her life in the house. As I flipped through the pages, I stumbled upon a horrifying entry dated years ago. "The house has ears. It knows my secrets. If I don't confess, it will consume me." Chilled, I continued reading. My grandmother had written about how the house seemed to know her thoughts and fears, twisting her own words against her. Every time she had a negative thought, an unsettling event would follow. Items would go missing, her reflection in the mirror would smirk back at her, and she'd hear whispers in the dead of night, recounting her darkest secrets. That night, I decided to test the journal's claims. I lay in bed and whispered my fears into the dark, my regrets, my failures, my hidden insecurities. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and the house creaked ominously in response. I dismissed it as paranoia. But then, I woke in the middle of the night to a voice echoing through the halls. "Confess or be consumed." Panic surged through me. I bolted upright, glancing at the clock. It was 3:33 a.m., the same time my grandmother had mentioned in her journal, the hour of the witching. The next morning, I awoke to find the journal lying open on the floor. A new entry was written in my grandmother's handwriting, though I had never touched the journal since last reading it. The entry read, "You did not listen. Now it knows your deepest fear." Heart pounding, I flipped to the last page. The final line was scrawled in frantic letters. It will come for you when you least expect it. As I read those words, the lights flickered and a cold draft swept through the room. That evening, I decided to leave the house. But as I packed my belongings, I discovered something horrifying. All my possessions had been rearranged in ways I couldn't explain. My clothes were folded in neat piles, yet the furniture was out of place, as if someone, or something, had been watching and waiting. Finally, I made it out the door, convinced that I had escaped whatever malevolent force resided within those walls. But as I drove away, my phone buzzed with notifications. I pulled over to check my messages, only to find a photo that sent chills down my spine. It was a picture of me, taken from inside the house, standing in my bedroom with my back turned. The timestamp showed it had been taken just minutes ago. I never returned to that house. To this day, I live with the knowledge that it knows my secrets, and perhaps it is waiting for the day I let my guard down, just as it did with my grandmother. As the door to one terror closed, another opened wide, inviting us in. My very own stalker. I know I'm being followed. At first it was just a feeling, but now I have concrete evidence. What scares me is the fact that if I just stopped thinking about it and made just a couple of different moves, I still wouldn't know that I am being followed. I will tell you how I figured out that I have my very own stalker. It all started 2 days ago. It was a Wednesday morning like any other. I work at a sandwich shop in the town next to mine, so the most convenient way of getting there in time is to take the train. The negative side of my job is that I never work night shifts, so I have to wake up very early every day. The positive side is that all my traveling expenses are paid and the salary is surprisingly good. While walking towards the train station, which was only like 10 minutes away from my house, I always had headphones on, which is the universal, "I don't have the energy to talk to anyone" sign. Of course, headphones don't stop everyone. There's always going to be that one person that desperately wants to talk to me, even though I am obviously not interested. That's exactly what happened while I was on my way to the train station. A man stopped his car just as I was about to cross the road and rolled down the driver's side window. He greeted me with a smile and asked me if I knew where the nearest supermarket is. I took off my headphones with slight annoyance noticeable on my face. Then I pointed at the direction of the supermarket. He thanked me and immediately sped off in the direction of the supermarket. I continued my walk towards the train station. I already had a monthly ticket, so once I arrived, I immediately entered the train and took a seat. As usual, some man asked me if he could take the seat next to me. "Sure," I said, while not even bothering to look at the man. I didn't sleep long enough last night and I was just beginning to feel the side effects. I'm sure it only took me around 3 minutes and I was sound asleep. My phone alarm woke me up just as the train arrived at my station, so I instantly got up and went to the sandwich shop. Luckily for me, it was only 2 minutes away from the train station. Work wasn't too eventful, just the usual stacking cheese, salami, and pickles on sourdough bread for hours and hours. Once I finished work, I remembered I had to meet up with a friend of mine so we can go and watch a movie back at my hometown cinema. I quickly got on the train once again, and after the usual 20-minute ride, I was back in my hometown. Unfortunately, I realized that I would be late if I didn't take the bus because the cinema was a good 15 minutes walk away from the train station. Fortunately, the train station and bus station are right next to each other, so I managed to hop on the bus, which was overcrowded. But I couldn't complain. I couldn't find a free seat, but it was a short ride, and it's definitely better than arriving late at the cinema. While tightly holding onto the bus pole, a man carrying a heavy suitcase bumped into me. He apologized and politely asked me if I could just move to the right so he could put his suitcase next to the pole. I didn't mind, so I slightly shifted to the right, but then a strange feeling hit me. I was always a paranoid person, so having a feeling that someone's watching me wasn't uncommon, but this was definitely more than just paranoia. I turned around and saw just a normal bunch of people minding their own business, which obviously didn't seem unusual. Before I could come to a better conclusion, the bus stopped, so I stopped thinking about it and exited the bus. I met up with my friend minutes later. I was relieved to have made it on time. We took our seats in the packed cinema and tried enjoying the movie, which wasn't easy to do because some random kids started yelling and laughing as soon as the movie started. Their antics were promptly stopped by a man sitting right behind my friend. He wasn't too happy about their behavior, so he yelled at them, telling them to shut up or he'll personally come over to their seats and shut them up. I found it funny how they immediately went radio silent after the man's warning. He was probably overreacting a little bit, considering they were just kids. But in the end, I couldn't blame him, considering he made our movie night much more bearable. As soon as the movie ended, I told my friend that I'm extremely tired and that I'm just going to go back home and bury myself in the pillow. However, while walking back home, the same feeling of being watched hit me again. In my mind, I started putting the puzzle pieces back together. I came to a dark realization which froze me in place. The man that asked me for directions in the morning, the man that took a seat next to me in the train, the man with the suitcase in the bus, the man that yelled at the kids in the cinema, those were all the same man. Only when I started rewinding what I saw today in my mind is when I realized that this person was following me throughout the day. He only slightly changed his appearance each time I saw him. While he was in the car, he was wearing glasses and a baseball cap. In the train, he was wearing sunglasses, although he wore no cap. In the bus, he was wearing a completely different suit and wasn't wearing any eyewear or hat. In the cinema, he was once again wearing glasses and no cap. What was always the same was his voice. That's the only thing he didn't change. If I focused on it for more than a minute, I could have figured out he was following me hours ago. I really wish it was some weird one-in-a-million coincidence. I tried to calm my mind by lying to myself, hoping that the guy and I just had a similar schedule for the day, so we just kept bumping into each other. Regrettably, as soon as I came home and started getting ready to take a shower, I confirmed my suspicion. Before dropping my clothes in the laundry basket, I noticed a small piece of paper in the back pocket of my pants. I quickly grabbed it and realized it's actually a crumpled receipt, not just a random receipt, but a receipt from the sandwich shop I work at. On the front of the receipt, right next to the price of the sandwich, I saw a small red hand-drawn smiley. It looked like a basic smiling face emoji drawn with a red pen, although it had red X's instead of eyes. Written in between its eyes and mouth was the word Roman. On the back of the receipt, written neatly with the same black marker, was a short question which read as follows: "Have you noticed me yet?" I was immediately stunned and left in a state of shock. My mind went blank as I stared at the receipt. After a couple of minutes of staring at the eerie smiley, I snapped out of it and decided to just take a quick shower and then try to go to sleep. I finished my shower and went straight to bed. Even though I was both mentally and physically drained, I just couldn't sleep. I was rolling around in bed, thinking about my disturbing follower. I prayed he just playing a sick prank on me, and that the message on the receipt would be the end of it. At exactly 22:10, I heard a loud knock at my front door. I almost thought I was going insane and that I just imagined it out of sheer paranoia. Nonetheless, I looked through the peephole, and as expected, there was no one there. I went back to bed and chalked up the knocks to my imagination. After lying in bed for hours and uninterruptedly thinking about the weird smiley, I finally cracked the code. 10 in Roman numerals is X, so 2 X's should be 20 or 2 10s. I'm almost certain, in my case, it means 2 10s, because I heard the knock at my door at exactly 10:10 p.m. I'd be happy if I could say that this was the last stalker-related experience I had. Unfortunately, that would be a lie, because I saw him again yesterday. You think that was bad? Let me tell you about the horror that followed.